Hey guys. This is part 6 of What If Naruto Was Banished to Unknown Lands. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start.
We are pain, that's all. We are God.
Chapter 25, The Stars, the Moon. Naruto took a deep breath and opened his eyes, the crimson lines around his lids denoting his channeling natural energy. The rock hurtling towards him was easily 5 feet across. He brought his right foot forward and drove his palm toward it, channeling the natural energy throughout his body. The rock exploded into millions of fragments and clouds of dust. Right behind it came another boulder, hurtling towards him at incredible speed. He ground his toes into the ground and leaned forward, grabbing the boulder in mid-flight and twisting, flung it straight up into the air. He bent at the waist and brought his forearm down, parallel to the ground, gathering his chakra. It swirled around while the boulder reached its apex above him. In a flash, Naruto was on top the boulder, using his version of a Hiraishin to appear a foot or so above it. With a crack, he slapped the rock with his open palm, pushing chakra into it, trying to spread it evenly across the entire target. The result was devastating. Sand rained down upon the training field. Pa-Toad looked on with approval. Naruto was progressing nicely. His use of Toad Kata was improving in leaps and bounds. His control of natural energy was also almost perfect. However, Pa thought that Naruto seemed distracted. He was running through the exercises almost like he was on autopilot. When Naruto landed, Pa hopped over to him. "Why aren't you concentrating?" he asked sternly. Naruto looked down at his palm and formed a Rasengan. He showed it to Pa. "I don't understand how I can put elemental chakra into this," Naruto said plaintively. "I've been thinking about it night after night. I just don't see it. I tried a shadow clone, pushing wind chakra into it, but it just blows up, and I don't understand why." Pa looked at the spinning ball closely. "I see. Naruto, what forms do your wind attacks normally take? Cutting attacks or blunt attacks?" "Yes. Both of which for you are massive attacks. If it's one thing I've realized, it's that you just don't understand things on a small scale. So think bigger." Naruto nodded thoughtfully. "Think bigger. Shigao Valley, east of Tangoku. I'm completely bored," Inari said to no one in particular, gazing into the crowd from above the canopy of the wagon he was on. They'd arrived at the valley 3 days ago without incident. Since then there had been a steady influx of traders. Now the valley was the busiest place Inari had ever seen, and he'd been to quite a few big cities with his grandfather Tazuna when they traveled. Mabry sure had gotten the word out to anyone who might possibly want to trade, and everyone showed up. Mabry made certain that flags bearing the symbol of Tangoku ringed the caravan and trading area. "Gotta let everyone know who they're dealing with," he had said with a smile and a wink. The quality of the goods coming from Tangoku was of extremely high grade. Textiles, clothing, pottery, jewelry. All of it was selling. Gold was flowing freely between merchants and traders. It made Inari a little nervous, all that gold. Like they were ripe to be attacked. It seemed destined to happen. Mabry fluttered around here and there, assisting when some haggling got out of hand, but otherwise it was all peaceful. Nothing materialized on the first day. Nor the second. Today was the 3rd day, and they would be packing up soon to head back. Inari felt like his nerves were raw and stretched, just waiting for something to happen. His teammates were also likewise feeling the weight of the responsibility on their shoulders. As the first batch of academy graduates, they represented their village. His big brother Naruto's village. He would not allow them to bring disgrace to it. He glanced around the caravan looking for his friends and teammates. He spied Genosuke sprawled out seemingly asleep on a stool slightly to the side of the massive crowd. Inari knew he was not asleep, however. Every now and then Gen's seeing eye stick hit the ground, faintly. So small a movement most would miss it. But each time he did, it released a low-grade chakra pulse that allowed him to see everything better than a normal person could. He once described it like a bat sending out sound waves. Of course Inari knew what a bat was, but the whole concept of sound waves was a little too much for him. He just nodded and smiled. He knew all he needed to. Genosuke could see better than he could, and could pick out things he might miss. Right now, he was monitoring the crowd looking for weapons. Across on the other side of the crowd, Miran was in the shadows between two wagons, her golden eyes glinting in the darkness. Somewhere on the outside was Sirin. He was supposed to remain hidden, as an ace in the hole for if they were attacked. The dynamic of their team was strong. Initially, Tenchi-sensei had wanted to split them into a 3-man cell. It was how most ninja teams were arranged. Well, nothing about Tangoku was conventional. The 4 of them were a cohesive unit. The first team out of the academy from the City of Heaven. A low whistle came up from Genosuke's position. To the typical passerby it would seem as though he was whistling a song, but it was a signal they had all worked out. Inari tensed, on high alert now. He scanned the crowd. There. He saw a man in a brown cloak moving awkwardly. Then another, and another. He counted 10 men in brown cloaks moving through the crowded marketplace. He hummed the tune Genosuke was whistling to himself, excitement coursing through him. They talked about it so many times that he moved without thinking. Tenchi-sensei had drilled it into them. When faced with a larger force, and cannot retreat, then strike first, strike hard, strike fast. There was one cloaked man who'd stopped right beneath Inari's wagon, shifting nervously from side to side. Inari let out a low breath and dropped down silently behind the man, clubbing him and dropping him to the ground instantly. In the same fluid movement, he pulled him beneath the wagon and out onto the other side, moving fluidly enough that he hoped no one saw the attack. He propped the man up against the wagon and listened. No one raised any sort of alarm. Quickly, he flung open the man's coat and revealed a series of daggers strapped all over his body. With a nod to himself, having confirmed that he could not be up to any good, he climbed swiftly back to the top of the wagon. The other potential bandits had not yet noticed one of their number missing. Genosuke was now walking through the crowd like a wraith towards where 3 of the bandits were approaching a table with Tangoku merchants and Mabry. Inari could have sworn he saw Mabry looking at them and glancing at him with a small smile. Inari eyed the remaining 6 men in coats, catching Miran's eye and nodding towards them. She smiled and did not move. A shimmer of water beneath a wagon across from him told Inari where Sirin was now placed, waiting for his signal. The first of the 3 men drew an impossibly large hammer from beneath his coat and slammed it down, breaking the merchant's table. Mabry and the merchants scrambled back. The hammer swung again, knocking a female merchant who hadn't moved quickly enough aside. "We've come for your valuables. Make any wrong moves and everyone here dies," he shouted. Mabry nodded grimly, holding the injured female merchant. Her arm and at least a few ribs had to have been broken. He watched closely to see how the cherubs performed. Inari sprang towards the 2 men closest to him, trusting in his teammates. He brought his mini crossbows to bear on them, firing in midair. His first bolt took the first man in the neck. The other was moving with some skill and managed to avoid the arrow. He drew a wicked-looking 2-pronged sword and turned to face Inari with a snarl. Genosuke stepped right behind the man who had slammed the hammer through the desk, mere inches from his back. The other 2 men flanked him and stared down in surprise at this boy who had appeared from nowhere. Gen smiled and tapped his stick once more on the ground. The man with the hammer turned slowly to see what was behind him. Gen took one of his throwing knives and sliced once across, deep, then stepped back. Before anyone knew what was going on, the man's bowels slipped out in a torrent. He stared in shock as he spilled onto the dirt. The 2 other men reached for their swords in a panic, but Gen just looked like he jumped up slightly, arms outstretched like a crucifix, and quickly retracting. He took another step backwards. Both men's eyes bulged at the throwing knives that were thrust through the soft underside of their jaws and into their brains. Blackness took them. The large hammer-wielding man slumped down and gurgled, trying to pull his intestines back into his body like wet slippery rope. Miran clanged her fists together, her metal gloves sparking. The 2 bandits closest to her saw her face, and a flash of gold before she disappeared. The first man took a metal fist to his nose without ever knowing what was happening, the bone shards impaling his brain. He fell in a slump silently. The second swung his sword in a wide arc wildly, hoping to catch something, anything. A merchant who was too close screamed in pain as the sword sliced his back. Miran appeared again behind this bandit and slammed her fist into the back of his neck. The sharp crack told her that he'd never move again. Sirin solidified with a feral grin not 2 feet away from his targets. After days of doing nothing but waiting, it felt good to be active. He ran up the chest of the first man, moon somersaulting and kicking him in the chin. "Didn't expect that, did you?" He laughed. The second man swung a club at him, but he ducked under and swiped, taking his legs out from under him. Grinning madly, Saren jumped against the wagon wall, and back flipped against the man, cracking his neck with his knee. I call that one starship pain. He dissolved into a ball of water again, and shifted as the first man swung wildly about with a pair of daggers. He erupted beneath the man, and solidified inside of his reach. His legs wrapped around the man's neck and he fell forward, twisting as they hit the ground. And that's the Rough Rider! Saren laughed, looking around to see how his friends did. Inari blocked the sword strike with his left forearm bracer and countered with a strike to the man's solar plexus. He fell to his knees winded. Inari swung in a 360 backhand, letting the metal bracer catch the man on this side of his head. He fell in a heap and never got up again. With a look around to his friends, he saw that all of them had taken their targets out. Mabry stood up, motioning for someone to come take care of the injured merchants. Ladies and gentlemen, the protection of Tangoku extends to all of our guests here today. We'll have this cleaned up momentarily, and we can finish this last day of trading before we go home. Thank you for your patience. With a quick nod, the boys began moving the bodies away from the cheering crowds to the outside of the wagons. Inari got there first, to find that the first bandit he had clubbed was not there. He turned to see the man rushing at him with a small sledgehammer, a vicious snarl on his face. A hand came between the wagons and slammed a solid iron wok into the bandit's face. He crumpled backwards in a curse, blood streaming from his broken nose. An elderly man stepped out and hit him again with a wok. The bandit lay still, unconscious. Inari smiled at the man. Thank you? I guess I should have tied him up first. The older man turned and smiled warmly at him. We should thank you. My daughter and I have made arrangements to come with Master Mabry in the caravan back to Tangoku, so it's pleasing to see how well trained the genin are there. Inari laughed. Well, we're not called genin, we're tendu. But thanks. I'm Inari. The old man extended his hand to shake. I'm Tuchi, and my daughter Ayam will be coming with me. Inari, you know, I think I've heard your name before. Mabry nodded in satisfaction to himself as the cleanup completed. He kicked dirt over the blood stains on the ground. The young ones did well, if a little brutal. But that would serve his purpose just fine. It set the example that you did not interfere with Tangoku when they were trading. The merchants were happy, and felt safer than they had before the excitement. Several were clamoring for more frequent trading trips. They had almost completely sold out their goods, and the buyers were leaving happily as well. The quality of goods bought here would surely sell for much higher in their hometowns and profits would be had by all. Not for the first time he considered the problem of Tangoku being as isolated as it was. It made trade that much more difficult. He figured that they could just make monthly trips to this same spot, but it was hard to defend a wagon train. There were no walls, nothing to keep unwanted people out. Nor was sleeping in wagons at night comfortable for the merchants and buyers. Truthfully, he needed a safe town to take over and use once a month. He'd have to talk to Tenchi and the other council members about it when they got home. It would be difficult to explain, though. To a man, they were all fighters, and understood nothing about trade and commerce. Late into the evening he watched as the last buyer left, and the fires of the torches lit the happy faces of the merchants of Tangoku. A few wagons would be added to their train, a few people Mabry had met, and felt could be trusted to become useful citizens of Tangoku. They'd have to meet Naruto, of course, his word on it being final. Pack it up! Mabry shouted with a smile. We head home to Tangoku tonight. I mean for us to be home before the week is out. Sunagakure. It had been a little over a year and a half since the last Uchiha left Konoha, supposedly forever. It had been roughly 1 month since his return. Neither the Uchiha nor Konoha were happy about this, of course. As for Sasuke, nothing much had changed for him, save that he was already familiar with the training grounds Orochimaru had dragged him to this time. That was the pattern ever since he'd left Konoha to join Orochimaru, to gain power from him. They would move locations every other week or so, always underground or well-hidden hideouts or labs or prisons or pretty much any place where Orochimaru could do his experiments and Sasuke could train. They would only stay longer if either Orochimaru wanted to finish an experiment first, or if Sasuke had yet to complete an objective of his training, such as when he'd been mastering his true lightning jutsu, Kirin, when they were in Lightning Country. To be in one place for this long was chaffing Sasuke after more than a year of constantly moving around from place to place. He was feeling anxious. And like he was going backwards. He needed something to do. Orochimaru, however, was happily designing all sorts of new experiments, while bringing out a few older, partially successful ones to satiate Danzo's lust for power. Besides, he'd had all he could stand of the snake's sanine for this week with his training from the day before. He had learned the lessons easily and quickly enough. He only needed to practice to fully incorporate the new techniques into his style and repertoire. It used to be he had a few dozen sound chunin to use as target practice, and if not them, a few hundred prisoners, or Kabuto could usually give him some interesting targets. Now, he had restrictions. Can't attack the ANBU, can't attack the root, can't attack the IWA ninja in Konoha. Too bad Naruto wasn't still around. If nothing else, Sasuke could always count on the dobe for a good fight whenever the mood struck either of them. Speak of the dobe, said Sasuke as he rounded the corner of one building and saw something unexpected. It was some graffiti on the wall of an old abandoned building. Sasuke's memories told him the building used to be the Ichiraku ramen stand that Naruto would always drag them to after a successful mission. Sasuke always liked the pork ramen. He vaguely recalled a report that just a week before about 90% of all civilian-run businesses disappeared overnight. Apparently Ichiraku ramen was one of them. The graffiti was an orange spiral, modeled after the circular patch that had been on the back of Naruto's jacket and on the shoulder patches of the Konoha standard uniform. A patch that, the Uchiha realized, was absent in the modern uniform under Danzo's regime. Instead it had been replaced by the symbol for the root, which was just a katakana in white on a black patch. Older shinobi merely changed their attire so they didn't bother wearing anything resembling a standard Konoha uniform, which was the way most could tell the difference between root ninja, Konoha ninja, and IWA ninja. Stepping closer to the graffiti, Sasuke saw that there was more to it than just the orange spiral. At the center were the kanji for Na, although they were spaced oddly. Na? He said out loud, exorcism? Then he caught the light a certain way on the graffiti and realized that it wasn't the word Na, but the abbreviation for NA. Remembering a debrief from the other day, Sasuke smirked and almost laughed as he realized what he was looking at. A tag for Naruto's army. Who would have thought, he mused, the dobe gets an army named after him and becomes a kage to boot. All before he was 16 years old. Most ninja hadn't even made jounin by his age, and he was a kage with a village and an underground movement named after him, all at his beck and call. Sasuke allowed a brief surge of jealousy to rise up within him as he thought of what he would do with such means at his disposal. Itachi's days would be numbered. As it was, while the younger Uchiha was working on a plan, recent changes had forced him to reevaluate some factors. It would be at least another 2 years, possibly more, before he would be ready to face his clan's murderer. He needed an edge, and while Orochimaru used to be that edge in preparing him, seeing Danzo, all his forces, and the state of Konoha, he knew it was no longer enough. Perhaps. Sasuke dismissed the thought before it had even formed. Whoever or whatever Naruto's army was, they were just dissidents and pranksters. There used to be only a single elite ninja among their ranks, and he had fled Konoha months ago, never to be seen or heard from again. That it was the same elite ninja that had given Sasuke the key to his ultimate technique was irrelevant, as the man would be killed on sight if ever seen near Konoha again. Whoever else was a part of Naruto's army was insignificant, and obviously pathetic if they were resorting to tagging as their only means of rebelling now. Putting it out of his mind, Sasuke resumed his walk to the training grounds. He needed to do something. He wanted to practice, but there were none worthy, or freely available, to practice with. That was when he spotted a familiar face among the crowd of civilians clearing a path as Sasuke walked amongst them. Ino was minding her own business when the next to last person she'd ever thought she'd never want to see appeared right in front of her. For years, seeing Sasuke was the highlight of her day, and being the subject of his attention was what she strove for most days. So it surprised her how much she didn't want to see Sasuke or be the subject of his attention at that precise moment, when he appeared in her path on her way back to her parents' flower shop, from the administration building, where she was now being trained as an IT ninja, by her father no less. Ino, the Uchiha, greeted her. She bowed her head once and continued on, saying only his name in reply. Uchiha-san. He stared after her for a few seconds before grabbing her by the arm and said, I need your assistance with something. Come with me. Ino stopped walking and locked her arm in place. Slowly, calmly, she turned to face her former crush and told him, Let go of my arm, Sasuke. Come with me, and I just may, he said. Ino no longer needed just eye contact in order to enact her family jutsu, although in order for it to work at all it needed either eye contact or physical contact. Fortunately for her, Sasuke was providing exactly that. She was inside his mind before he knew what was going on. She repeated, directly into his mind this time, "Let go of my arm. Now." He released her. Frowning, his Sharingan activated as he followed her to the roof where she had retreated to. She was out of sight with no physical trace to say where she'd gone, but with his Sharingan active, he could track her by her chakra and the trail she left behind from that. It was a fun little chase, a good distraction, which is exactly what he needed. He finally managed to corner her right across from the Hyuga hot springs. "What is this even about?" she screamed at him. "Come with me and find out," was all he would say to her. "No!" She defied him, and drew two kunai. "Fine then, be that way," he scoffed and made to attack. Before he got even 2 steps, however, he was stopped by a squad of ANBU. None of them were displaying the root badges. In fact, they were cloaked from head to toe and wore the standard ANBU animal masks, telling Sasuke more than enough about his current situation. "You really should pay more attention to your surroundings, Uchiha-sama," said a man in a long dark coat, his long blonde hair done back in a ponytail. Beneath the coat he wore the dark gray uniform of the IT division. "Especially when chasing my daughter for some non-given reason. What business is it of ANBU if I want to have a conversation with a kunoichi?" Sasuke accused him. "When that kunoichi happens to be my subordinate, a trainee in the IT division of ANBU, and one of the Hokage's personal secretaries," Yamanaka replied. "I don't know how much you and your master are used to getting away with, Uchiha-sama, but if you are of the belief that the Hokage, the Emperor of Konoha and IWA, is so desperate for the aid of your master that he gives you carte blanche, you are gravely mistaken. And what makes you say something so treasonous as to believe you speak for Danzo?" Sasuke smirked. He'd seen the type that was Danzo before. They loved to micromanage things, and at the slightest hint of a betrayal, heads would start to roll. Literally. "I am stating facts, Uchiha-sama," Inoichi said, being very calm about the current situation. "It is the Hokage's duty to protect his people. The Hokage conquered another nation and more than doubled the resources that we have to call upon and more than doubled our fighting strength with but a single battle in this last war. He's brought your master here to resupply our fighting force, in order to bolster our defenses and prepare for future conflict. These are all well-known facts. But if you and your master start acting like you are the emperors here..." Sasuke frowned. "Then the civilian population and any civilian-born ninja might get the idea of a civil war in their heads, especially if they see that they can no longer count on the protection of the Hokage. How long will this alliance last if you start attacking the Hokage's personal secretary? And if you were to actually go unpunished? Or, far more likely, if something unfortunate had happened to Yamanaka-san here, in order to maintain the alliance for as long as possible, what might your master have to give up? His protection of you, perhaps?" Sasuke scowled, his hand reaching for his sword. The ANBU all around tensed appropriately. "I merely wanted to spar with her, just some training," said Sasuke. "But now that I have half a dozen ANBU to play with, this will work out fine too." "Kukukukuka." Sasuke scowled again, his hand releasing his sword. All the ANBU visibly dropped all tension in their bodies, but one didn't even need to look at them to see that they were even more on guard than before. Inoichi and Ino Yamanaka, on the other hand, both practically sighed with relief. "What seems to be the problem here?" Orochimaru asked as he slithered his way amongst the masked shinobi to stand next to his apprentice. "Just a misunderstanding," said Inoichi with a shrug. "Apparently Uchiha-sama never learned the proper way to ask another ninja for a training spar. Not to say that he wasn't taught, only that he failed to learn the lessons his betters endeavored to teach him." "Oh really?" Orochimaru grinned wickedly at the blond man in the black coat. "Perhaps you would care to explain why your apprentice approached my daughter and merely said, 'Come with me,' rather than offer an invitation to train with him?" Inoichi crossed his arms expectantly. Yes, kukuku, of course, a lesson that we all learn in the academy, as I recall." Orochimaru licked his lips slightly. "Exactly," Inoichi smiled. "What is the meaning of this?" Root had arrived. "A misunderstanding only, Centipede-san." Inoichi was starting to sweat a bit. "Nothing to trouble Danzo-sama with, unless of course his honored guest would care to make a complaint, that is?" Now all eyes were on Orochimaru, who was basking in it, or so it seemed. In the end though, the entire thing was swept under the rug. The next morning, an announcement went out to all active ninja through their supervisors and down the chain of command until even the dead last genin doing D ranks had heard about it. There were to be no more unauthorized trainings or sparring, and if there were to be any, all training between ninja above Chunin rank had to be reported to their immediate supervisor and approved. If there were multiple supervisors or ninja of different ranks involved, then it would go all the way up the chain of command if it had to. Requests could be denied at any time, as well as rejected by the ninja involved, but the more important aspect, and the given reason for the new rule, was to keep active duty ninja from being unnecessarily injured during training. Afternoon, Training Ground 7, Sasuke challenged Ino again, but this time according to the new rule. Kabuto heard about it, and as he was the senior apprentice he was the one that approved the training spar, only he made it sound more like Ino challenged Sasuke. To everyone's surprise, despite the obvious untruth, Ino accepted the challenge and agreed to face Sasuke in a training spar. They met just outside the IT division employee entrance, and walked together to Training Ground 7. Neither said a word the whole way. Once there, they stood across from each other and waited, still not saying a word. A crow cried out and took off from one of the nearby trees. They both vanished before even the first leaves had been shaken loose. Sasuke considered activating his Sharingan, but this was Ino he was facing. He wanted to test himself, not kill her. So he searched for her with his normal, non-enhanced senses. He was surprised when he detected her so easily. Ah! Ino startled when he appeared in front of him. She threw the kunai she'd had behind her back at him. It had been a wild throw and he easily dodged it, charging straight at her. She had another kunai in her other hand. Before she could do much else beyond raise the weapon to defend herself, he'd drawn his katana and parried her block, knocking her to the ground. She narrowly dodged his follow-up, rolling into the underbrush, and making a wild racket as she raced to get to another hiding spot. Sasuke waited for the noises to die down. It was no fun if there wasn't at least some challenge to it, right? Once the rattling noises had ceased, he spat out a couple of fireballs into the tangle of trees around him. He didn't want to burn down the whole forest, so he kept them low level, actually having to struggle a bit not to release so much chakra into the attacks. The rattling and rustling started again from his right, and moving away from the flames. Smirking, he jumped into the trees and used the smoke to hide his presence. He activated his Sharingan. Tracking her was easy. Getting ahead of her in the smoke from his fire attacks, even easier. He appeared in her path, sword sheathed and made to punch her. She blocked on instinct. Good, he thought, so she's been trained to be a ninja after all. Let's see where she's at. He started off at the level any genin would be at after a month's training, keeping his attacks and blocks at a relatively slow speed, and using only the most basic at that. Ino kept up and even parried his attacks a couple of times, working to either get a hit at his face or knock him back with varied kicks and leg sweeps. After about a minute of this, he moved it up a level, to where he was at when he left Konoha, i.e. where a genin would be at after a year's training. She kept up with his increased speed, though after her first attempt at blocking him she switched to dodging and avoiding his blows instead. She managed to get a hit through his defenses, one that would have hit him next to his left eye, but he twisted his head out of the way just enough so her fist never so much as ruffled a hair on his head. He escalated his skill level to your average chunin, and soon had her on the defensive, landing blows any time she couldn't successfully dodge or avoid them. She started trying to block again, but that usually ended up injuring her just as much as if she'd let him hit in the first place. None of her attacks, not that she was attacking much anymore, made it through his defenses any longer, and even if they had they would have had no hope of landing any damage against him. Seeing her taijutsu level for what it was, he scoffed, and went full out against her, just to show her what she faced, and so she would know her place. Flashing behind her, he hit a nerve cluster that was right below her right ribcage and above the kidneys. It paralyzed her for 60 seconds, and would have been broken the moment her face hit the ground. But to a ninja, 60 seconds is 60 eternities. For the first 30 seconds, he used her as a training dummy, making sure not to break bones or do any internal damage, but he wasn't above bruising her entire body with as many combos as he could fit in against her paralyzed body. He finished with a strong backhand to her face that knocked her flat on her back. Instantly she was rolling to the side to get her legs back under her and scrambling away from him, tears running down her face now. That was the other way to reverse the paralysis, other than waiting the 60 seconds, which was to realign the nerve cluster and that was as simple as knocking them on their back rather than their face. It was a lot more painful though. I suppose I should explain why it is you had to go through this, Ino. Sasuke spoke condescendingly. Make it so you can understand what all the pain is for, so you can understand. He sneered, and as his whole body began to spark and the distinctive sound of the Chidori started up, he concluded, but I doubt you can ever truly understand, because the fact of the matter is, I was just so very bored. At least this way, I get to test my new jutsu. Try not to move, Ino. We'll get to the moving target practice in our next spar. Chidori Samban no Jutsu. And after that, all Ino knew was pain. When she regained consciousness, Sasuke was standing over her and was holding a single lightning element Samban needle between his fingertips. He put it into her forehead. She screamed and screamed, but she didn't pass out this time. He dispelled all the other Samban in her body, allowing them to ground out, leaving only insect bite-sized burn marks all over her, save for that one that he'd put into her brain. It was still hurting her, and above all else, it was keeping her conscious and would not allow her to fall unconscious no matter what he did to her. And he did it to her a lot, shooting wave after wave of those Chidori Samban into her, from different angles, at different speeds, at different intensities, adjusting how much chakra he put into the technique each and every time. He even spent over 15 minutes alternating trying it with the Sharingan and without, just to see what the difference was. It wasn't until he started looking bored, and even then not until at least a dozen more experiments, that he finally removed the one needle keeping her conscious and allowed her to pass out. Her whole body was riddled with electric burns, and the bruises were already turning a mottled brown-blue with flushes of red by the time he finally walked away from her. After he was done with her, he left her there and went back to his apartment, the same one he'd lived in after the Uchiha massacre, ironically enough, and cleaned up. On his way to the Hokage's office, which were actually rented out of what used to be the Senju mansion, seeing as the new tower was still being planned and construction hadn't even started yet, he stopped to get something to eat. As he reported in, he mentioned that somebody might want to go and check on his opponent at the training grounds, as he hadn't seen her moving and didn't know if she was still there or not. A genin team, on standby for their next assignment, was sent to check the grounds and take her to the hospital if they found her still there. Just before going in for his debrief on the sparring exercise, he heard one of the genin reporting back to the root chunin on duty that they had found her still there, lying exactly where he'd left her hours beforehand. Also, something about her regaining consciousness just as they got there and insisting that she be taken to her family estate rather than the hospital. Probably a good idea, he mused to himself as he entered the debriefing room. Kabuto would probably have her added to his collection by complications with recovery or some other excuse. He put the whole thing out of his mind and made his report. Evening, Hokage's office. Did you have fun, Sasuke? Kabuto asked Sasuke as the Uchiha left the debriefing room. The stone-faced ninja said nothing and kept walking away. You bastard! And Noichi Yamanaka came around the corner, fury in his eyes. He went right up to Sasuke and stopped just short of throttling the younger shinobi. It was just supposed to be a simple sparring match. A sparring match? You didn't have to. You bastard! Sasuke merely glared up into the older Yamanaka's eyes for a short amount of time, his dark eyes penetrating into the older man's pale blue ones, until the blue orbs flinched away. He brushed past Ino's father without saying a word, Kabuto grinning sadistically in the wake of this scene. What did you do to young Ino-san? The medic inquired, adjusting his glasses the way he usually did when amused by something. I perfected my new technique. She'll be fine in a few weeks. I used a low-level version, so there was no permanent nerve damage, the Uchiha answered, sounding bored and annoyed all at the same time with every word he spoke. I had heard that Yamanaka-san insisted she be treated within the clan, not trusting our medics any longer. How odd, Kabuto mused. Sasuke scoffed, prompting a curious glance from Orochimaru's elder apprentice. They trust the hospital just fine. It's you and Orochimaru and your presence at the hospital they don't trust. That should be obvious to everyone, said Sasuke, turning and walking away from Kabuto. The medic allowed him to move on and turned a different corner. He idly wondered what he should report to Orochimaru-sama first. That Sasuke was even more ruthless than previously suspected? Or that he now had a clue as to why hospital admittance was at an all-time low since before Konoha's founding, when there wasn't even a hospital in the first place? Outskirts of Konoha, Asuma stretched, rubbing the feeling back into his legs. The bunker he was in was massive, at least 500 square yards, and he had taken to walking it to try to regain some of his strength and mobility. As he was now, he was a bit more mobile than a civilian, but not quite as agile as a ninja should be. He'd only seen Shikamaru over the past month. No one else ever came with food or news. But he understood why. Danzo's control was absolute, and his ears were everywhere. Konoha had changed. Asuma scowled. He would avenge his village. As a Sarutobi, and son of the third Hokage, he would take back the land from Emperor Danzo. But a pragmatic man, Asuma had to admit his limitations. He could do very little here. The NA was already functioning as a small resistance movement from within the walls, but their advantage was that no one knew who they were. Shikamaru was needed as a strategist, but he, Asuma, was not. He had made the decision to go to Wave as soon as possible, and try to put together a small guerrilla army. With such, he would bite at the flanks of Danzo's army, and fade away before they could be attacked. He sighed. That was the plan, easier said than done. Today would be the first step. Today he left for Wave. Sunagakure, Niji looked up at the guards as he walked through the gate. The guards perched above, that he could see, watched them warily. Hinata and Tenten walked a few paces behind him. He'd waited until they were a day out of Konoha before explaining his plan to his cousin and former teammate. Officially they were here for him to take over Guy's team, but in truth it was a way for them to train away from the prying eyes of Danzo. Their pack camel trailing behind them, Niji entered the passageway into Sunagakure through the impenetrable mountainside. The cool shadow of the pass felt blissful against his overheated skin. He hoped that he would get a chance to explain the plan to his former Jounin sensei without the green beast of Konoha flying off the handle. Okay, that makes sense. Of all things, Niji did not expect Mado Guy to be reasonable. But he just nodded pensively. They were alone in the rooms Gaara had assigned them as ambassadors from Konoha. Of course they were spied on, Niji was sure of it. But Guy seemed to dismiss that with a wave of his hand and a look of annoyance. Tenten and Hinata were freshening up from the trip in an adjoining room while Niji, as the Jounin of the group, spoke to his former sensei. You may have provided us with a perfect entry point. Jiraiya wanted us to get someone senior close to Danzo. We hear he is getting more and more cautious. Guy looked to Niji for confirmation. Niji nodded. Yes. He takes no audience save for Orochimaru himself. Everyone else must stay a certain distance away except for his most loyal root. And they all must show their face. Work has begun on his new tower, and from what I gather it's going to not just be a monument, but a fortress in and of itself. Guy looked pensive. Well, we are uniquely gifted with a way though those defenses. He turned to the far side of the room where a red door stood unopened. You can come out now, Guy said quietly. The door opened slowly, and Niji rubbed his eyes in disbelief. A second Mado Guy stood there. An exact perfect replica. He immediately activated his Byakugan, and was in even more disbelief. There was no difference at all that he could see. A slight chakra difference maybe, but the shape and form of it was identical. Well, what is this? A clone? He asked incredulously. My name is Kisaragi Seimin, the second guy said, in the same voice as Guy. The first guy nodded. Jiraiya sent him a few weeks ago. Kisaragi can become anyone he touches. The longer the touch, the more perfect the copy. Yes, a few seconds touch allows me to look like anyone, but if I can get a minute, I can copy their chakra and all attributes, like mannerisms and voice. Niji looked for flaws in the copy, and found none. The possibilities for such a person. You're an assassin, he said finally. Kisaragi nodded. That's the plan. I'll work my way close to him and take him out. Guy put his hand on Kisaragi's/Guy's shoulder. There is no other way. Danzo must be killed. The green beast of Konoha smiled at Niji just then. However, that is not our concern at the moment. Kisaragi will work Jiraiya's plan, disguised as me initially. I may not be able to show my good looks around Suna once Kisaragi leaves, but I will supervise your training along with Hinata and Tenten. Lee is already out doing his exercises. I trust you will be able to keep up, now that you've risen to Jounin. Niji swallowed silently, but showed no emotion on his face. This was what he had wanted, a chance to train harder without Danzo being able to judge his strength. Wasn't it? Tangoku, what is it? Senji shouted over the noise, racing along with Nagi and the other Daitenshi towards where the wind and light were coming from. It was deafening, like a continuous brain-numbing noise that had shattered all the glass in the village. A massive light accompanied it as well, as if the sun had come down to their island. As they ran towards it, Jiraiya and Tenchi fell in with them, racing towards the source. As they cleared the trees, they stopped abruptly, not believing what they saw in front of them. Naruto stood in the middle of the training clearing, struggling under the weight of a Rasengan easily the size of a house. He held it above him, arms outstretched as he struggled to balance the swirling chakra ball. He spotted them and gave a weak grin. "Give me a minute!" he shouted over the din. A pair of Naruto clone Senji did not see before appeared to be helping balance the ball. As they watched, Naruto looked like he was closing his arms together slowly. The massive ball started to shrink, smaller and smaller, until it was just slightly bigger than a person's head. Senji could feel the wind around him moving towards the swirling chakra. "He's doing it," Jiraiya said in amazement. "He's injecting wind chakra into the Rasengan." Senji glanced at Jiraiya for a second before looking back at his best friend. The Rasengan's shape warped slightly, and what looked like 4 spinning blades formed around the middle of it. Naruto held it over his head. It looked to all intents and purposes to Senji like a very large Fuma shuriken. "I couldn't see how to do it when it was small," Naruto shouted at them. "Pa told me think bigger, so I did. Once it was large enough, I realized I couldn't do 2 things at once, but if I had a clone I could. I formed the Rasengan shell and my clone mixed in the wind nature chakra. The other clone is just here to check for flaws." Tenchi smiled nervously. "Great," he shouted back. "But what are you going to do with that now? It's too dangerous to use that on the ground. We're still on a goddamn floating island." Naruto frowned and looked around, the spinning compact maelstrom suspended in his palm, now realizing what he'd done. Because he had poured so much energy into the giant Rasengan, it would be almost impossible to just disperse it without some sort of explosion. "Just throw it into the sky," Senji yelled anxiously. "I can't throw a Rasengan," Naruto yelled back. He concentrated on the ball, trying to leak the chakra slowly out of it, letting a tiny fissure open. Jiraiya motioned for them all to move back. "Run now, run far. If that blows, we'll all get hit." Naruto struggled to let the chakra out of the Rasengan, but it was like trying to hold back a raging river with a teacup. Senji stayed behind to watch, hoping his friend could do it. After what felt like hours, although it was mere seconds, the Rasengan shrank until it was no more than the size of a marble. It still emitted a high-pitched whine though, and Senji's skin crawled. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, the built-in human knowledge of impending danger. "Neru!" he began to shout. In the blink of an eye, Naruto lost control of the ball, and it exploded. Senji just remembered a white explosion and a deafening silence as Naruto looked to be screaming at him, but no words were coming out of his mouth. Then nothing. Jigaku Mountain Range, 5 miles east of Tangoku, Yoshi sat on the grass of the small hill studying the brick of heaven stone he had laid on the ground. His wild hair was more disheveled than normal as he made notes, studying it from every angle. "Fascinating Yoshi," he murmured to himself with a grin. The heaven stone performed beyond even his wildest predictions. After seeing how well it worked when formed into the gate to Tengoku, Yoshi had been exploring other uses for this wondrous product. So far he'd ruled it out as a material for cooking pots, as it absorbed far too much energy to be used for cooking. It also was the most uncomfortable surface he'd ever laid down on, despite it essentially being made of clouds, so it was useless as a mattress. But it did have potential, besides as a defensive wall, for other building materials. Because it absorbed so much heat and energy, a building made from heavenstone would be naturally cool and earthquake resistant. Yoshi looked at the brick again, checking its structural integrity. He walked back over to his modified Daedalus and fetched another brick. He was miles away from the island, wanting to try his experiments away from the source of the heavenstone, to see how well it lasted. He noticed the sun going down and frowned. Maybe he should be getting back. With a start, he realized the brick in his hand fading away into mist. A quick glance told him the brick on the ground was likewise disappearing. Yoshi scribbled that down in his book, and sat down hard, looking at the mist. He'd not be going back home just yet. Tengoku. Hiroka pushed through the crowd at the entrance to the hospital, not caring whose feet she trampled. Panicked, she burst into the room where Senji and Naruto were laying on beds. Naruto had taken the worst of the explosion, but no one seemed to be bothering with him. Instead, Tsunade and Sakura were busy putting bandages on Senjai. Her Senjai, who was unconscious. What happened? Is he going to be okay? She asked. Tsunade didn't even look up. Naruto's Rasengan exploded. Thank Kami that he managed to bleed out some of the power from it. As it is, Naruto took the worst of it, but Senjai was only 50 yards away and he suffered several broken ribs and bruises about his body from the concussive blast. Sakura finished tying off a bandage and looked up with a face showing relief. He'll be okay, Hiroka, just banged up. A few weeks and he'll be back on his feet. Hiroka allowed herself to breathe, then glanced over at Naruto. Impossibly, his bruises and cuts seemed to be healing on their own. She'd heard about that ability of his, but never seen it before. She looked longingly at Senjai, wishing he had that ability as well. But she knew Tsunade and Sakura would take care of him. She whirled and left the hospital, ignoring the people who'd come to see what happened to Lord Tenshinhan after such a powerful explosion. She leapt to the rooftops once she'd made it to the streets, and headed for the training ground on the other side of the city to blow off some steam. Foolish girl. Noika's stick rapped her on the head again. Why can you not see the target? Is it not clear? Calamity heard the voice behind her, but had no illusions that Noik could be anywhere around her at this point. He had a way of throwing his voice in this training session to throw her off. Just because gracious Noik allowed your training partner to go visit his friend in the hospital, do you think he should likewise be allowed to slack off? The old taskmaster asked sweetly. No, master, Calamity replied, keeping her anger out of her voice, as that would only make things worse. She ached to remove the blindfold from her eyes and seek out the master of Senanju, but she knew better there too. Taking a breath, she drew back her bow again and reached out with her spirit as Nuik was teaching her to do. She felt something. The trees, the field, the wind, and something inanimate and foreign. With an outtake of breath, she loosed the arrow, feeling it move towards the target. Feeling it hit. Pathetic. Nuik rapped her on the head again. A child from my village could have done better. Take off the blindfold and start doing your forms. I'm tired of trying to teach a tadpole to fly today. Maybe tomorrow. Calamity heard Nuik move away and she took off the blindfold, looking after him as he walked back to his tea shop. She had come to like and respect the man and loathe him at the same time. Shaking her head, Calamity looked across the field to see where her arrows hit. The target had a cluster of 5 arrows. She had shot 7, and they were all clustered around the center, but not quite the bullseye of the target. With a scowl, Calamity walked towards them. Nagi sat alone in the room with Naruto and Senjai. Both were still unconscious, but Tsunade said they were just sleeping now. The crowd that had been outside had dissipated. Word of Naruto's miraculous healing was spreading through the village. Everyone was just glad the Tenshinhan was alive, as he'd handpicked and brought each one of them here to a new, better life. He watched them and sighed, his mind wandering back to the dream he'd had every night for the last month. That dream was someone screaming his name, someone on fire. Angrily, he slammed his fist down onto his leg. Just forget it, it's just a dream, he whispered to himself. Sometimes dreams can be pretty horrible though. Nagi almost jumped out of his skin at Naruto's voice. The blonde-haired teen was sitting up, rubbing his head. He glanced over at Senjai for a few seconds, then looked at Nagi, the question clear in his eyes. He'll be okay. Just some bones and bruises. Tsunade says a few weeks and he'll be back to normal, Nagi answered. Naruto nodded, looking at his own skin, mostly healed now. My own stupid fault for trying a jutsu that large so close to everyone. Next time I'll do it far away from the village. Nagi didn't respond, not sure what to say to that. It probably was a good idea. Naruto's jutsu were incredibly powerful. So what's this dream? Naruto asked, trying to take his mind off the guilt of hurting one of his best friends. Nagi shook his head. Just something from my past. I think, Nagi said hesitantly. Naruto looked at him, then away. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. I mean I've lots of things I'd rather not remember. Nagi nodded at him, and they just sat in silence for the remainder of the night, each lost in their own thoughts. Lo Yoshi! Mabry called out as their caravan topped the small hill. It had to be the crazy inventor. Who else would have a giant metallic bird thing next to him, or have hair that crazy? Yoshi looked up and waved at them, intently studying something on the ground. Mabry rolled his wagon closer to the inventor and peeked at what he was studying. It was a solid white brick. Yoshi was scraping at it with a knife. Is that heaven stone? Mabry asked, puzzled by Yoshi, not for the first time. Yoshi looked up and smiled. Yes, it is. Miraculous, isn't it? What an interesting stone. But it's not a stone, is it? Not at all. It's a cloud. But why the sun? That's the question. Mabry shook his head with a sigh. Once again, Yoshi, I have no idea what you're talking about. And when last have you bathed? I mean, you reek. Yoshi clapped his hands with excitement and stood up, his disheveled clothes blowing in the soft breeze. It's marvelous. See this brick? It has the same properties as Heavenstone in Tangoku. Impenetrable, impervious, heat-resistant, all of those things. But something more too. This far from the island, it's also solar-dependent. What? Mabry asked, totally confused. It relies on daylight. Yoshi has been here all week and rain or sun, doesn't matter. What matters is daylight. Once the sun sets, the brick disappears. Completely. Not a sign of its presence. Until morning, when it reforms in the exact same spot. Yoshi clapped his hands again. It's marvelous! Yoshi tilted his head suddenly and frowned. Of course, it means it's impractical as a building material this far from Tangoku. Who wants a house that disappears at night? Mabry smiled at him and started to agree, but stopped and stared off at the hill they were on. Yoshi had ridden here on his Daedalus, so that meant a windstream was nearby. Also, they were only a few hours from the foothills and the entrance. But even that wouldn't matter if the special seals of Jiraiya's were perfected. His eyes glazed over as the thoughts turned over in his head. He'd have to talk to the council about it. Come on, Yoshi, let's go home. You need food and a shower. IT Division Office, a week later, midnight. You did well, Ino, Inoichi congratulated his daughter. She sat before him, uninjured, unbandaged, and the perfect picture of health. Thanks, Dad, she blushed slightly, looking down to her lap. It was only here, at the heart of the IT division, or in the special bunker Shikamaru had shown her under her family's flower shop, that she could truly be herself. Outside of these secured locations, she, like her father and the rest of their family, had to maintain their masks at all times. Did you get a chance to check my work? It was a bit rushed out there, but I'm pretty sure I got everything, she said to her father. Near as I could tell, when I bumped into him in order to scream at him about your injuries, Inoichi chuckled, the Uchiha believes everything in his report is the absolute truth. I double-checked your work for the brief moment of eye contact he gave me. The seams are flawless. They are integrating with his long-term memory with no faults. Give it a month's time, or even another traumatic experience, or 3, and not even I would be able to tell that he had been memory wiped and false memories implanted. Ino let out a sigh of relief, fearing that she had somehow missed something, or something in the Uchiha's brain would have rejected the changes she had made to his mind. Thankfully, with her father's seal of approval, it was clear that she had not, and they had gotten away with it. Now, if you please, so I can share with the others, seeing as Shikamaru is still in hiding and isn't going to be coming out again anytime soon, Inoichi said to his apprentice, holding out his hands, show me what actually happened in your spar with the Uchiha. Ino nodded and took her father's hands, and together they both closed their eyes and relived the experience, from her point of view this time. Training Ground 7. They'd met just outside the IT division employee entrance, and walked together to Training Ground 7. Neither said a word the whole way. Once there, they stood across from each other and waited, still not saying a word. A crow cried out and took off from one of the nearby trees. They both vanished before even the first leaves had been shaken loose. They had both learned their lessons in stealth and remaining hidden quite well. Unfortunately, Ino hadn't been taught by a Sannin, nor had the experience of being on the run in hostile countries before now. They both knew that, and therefore Sasuke expected to find her soon and Ino expected him to find her soon, and made preparations accordingly. Ino kept moving, not stopping for an instant, laying whatever simple traps that she could without leaving a telltale sign that she'd been there. Unfortunately, due to the chakra signature they gave off when they were used, this excluded exploding tags. Sasuke initially hid himself amongst the branches of the trees overhead, but when he saw that there would be no attack, he put himself on the defensive and started tracking Ino the moment after. He was mildly impressed with her stealth, as he could not instantly find her even after really looking, and then again with her counter-tracking skills, as he saw 7 different trails she could have run through, all going in different directions with no real clue as to which one she went down. But of course this only impressed him because it gave him the impression that she wasn't a complete waste of his time. Finally, he lost patience and just decided to search above the trails and stay in the trees. When he caught signs, subtle signs, of traps having been laid, he knew he was on the right trail and hurried himself along the path he now found himself on. When he saw no further traps, he jumped down from the trees and soon found his opponent in a sunlit clearing, just standing there, her eyes closed. Sensing another trap, Sasuke stayed hidden in the shadows. A twig snapped. Sasuke frowned down at the offending piece of wood. Ino's eyes snapped open and she thought in the privacy of her mind, "Boys, I hope you're ready for this. Because there's no turning back now." She pulled out a kunai and held it before her, and something more that she hid behind her body. Seeing that his cover was blown, Sasuke casually stepped into the clearing like it had been his intention all along. "Not much of a chase. I was hoping for a little bit more sport, Ino," he said to her. "At least make the fight interesting." "I'll do my best, Uchiha," Ino remarked. She then shifted her left foot subtly, triggering the trap she'd set up before Sasuke had even started tracking her. There was the sound of a rope being cut, and movement out of the corner of his eye saved Sasuke's life as an impossibly large boulder came crashing down from the trees behind him. He dodged by leaping forward, and only after he'd gotten to his feet did he feel the trip wire he'd crossed, and it was only thanks to his heightened reflexes that he managed to see the giant log come swinging down at him from clear across the clearing. It was because he saw it coming that he was even more on guard, and a good thing too, as he saw that impossibly huge boulder that had nearly crushed him was now rolling straight at him. The proverbial rock in a hard place situation. He made to dodge, but Ino had thrown something at him, and he could see, even with non-enhanced eyes, that the ground on the only other direction he could go had been recently disturbed. Probably with a pitfall or some other basic trap. Drawing his sword, he deflected the kunai Ino had thrown at him, only to realize at the last possible second that he probably shouldn't have done that. There was ninja wire tied to the back of the kunai, and when he deflected it, it allowed Ino to wrap it around his katana like a bolo, and then with greater strength than he'd expected, his weapon was ripped from his hands. That was fine. He had others. Moments from impact with either the boulder or the log, he began to charge his chidori, the distinctive thousand-bird scream echoing off the trees. The boulder suddenly leaped up, just as he'd been preparing to destroy it to open that path. Unfortunately, that stunned him enough that he no longer had time to make good his escape from the log. On top of that, the boulder was now going to come down on top of his head. The log exploded in flames, as Sasuke switched signature techniques in mere moments, and the force of that explosion was easily enough to knock the boulder off course. Amidst the fiery debris, Sasuke soon found himself having to dodge all manner of projectiles, and not just kunai, but shuriken, spikes, throwing knives and even a bunch of high-speed ball bearings. Without his sword, it was more difficult, and the flaming splinters didn't help much, but a couple of quick shunshin and he was clear of the range of fire and now behind Ino, except she was behind him. "How?" "Sasuke," she called, and he turned, only to get a face full of a bag that released some kind of black cloud of some kind of poison. He coughed and quickly retreated. Orochimaru and Kabuto had been working on his poison immunity, and thankfully they had also taught him the few anti-poison chakra techniques. Even while he attempted to clear his system right then and there, Ino was informing him of what he was just discovering for himself. "That won't work," she said. "What did you?" He started to ask, suddenly overcome with a weakness he was unfamiliar with. His vision was starting to become unfocused and his eyes itched, and his nose and throat burned. "The Death Blossom is an overdramatic name for the flower Konoha uses in all its poisons," Ino informed him, not moving from her spot. "Except that it needs to be mixed with several other herbs, chemicals, and poisons in order to actually be able to kill anyone. The pollen, however, can cause paralysis if either ingested, inhaled, or allowed anywhere near the eyes or mouth." You. "Because it is just the pollen, however, the body doesn't react like it's been poisoned," she interrupted. "No, it responds with a severe and sudden allergy reaction. Paralysis takes a few minutes since it has to work its way through your system. Of course, a diluted version will just cause the allergic reaction. But a concentrated dose, like the one I just gave you, well." His eyes flashed red and reverted back to their basic black before the Sharingan even formed. It happened twice more before Ino finally explained what was happening. Your chakra control and even your chakra are going to be very erratic for the next 3 minutes. You can still use it, but it takes almost twice the effort that it once did. You have about 8 minutes now, before the paralysis kicks in full time, and you're lying on the forest floor. I wouldn't recommend trying to burn through it faster though, not unless you have some kind of fetish for being completely helpless and near-death experiences. The Sharingan finally formed and Sasuke charged ahead. Ino raised her kunai in defense, and twitched her right foot this time. Sasuke's body leapt back into his right almost before he knew why, but the reason became obvious when all the leaves and weeds at Ino's feet came alive and formed a protective cocoon around her, the leaves swirling and cutting at anything around her while the weeds grew to vines and covered every available space in the tangle of trees. They were all filled with Ino's chakra and made the perfect camouflage for her. Sasuke didn't hesitate in shooting out a fireball, not even bothering with announcing it, flashing through the hand seals so fast it looked like he didn't even do them. The greenery was all burned away, and even some of the trees around them caught on fire. But when it all cleared away, Ino was nowhere in sight. Sweating now, Sasuke felt the pressure to win like never before. Some of the things Orochimaru and Kabuto put him through were downright horrific, but they never did anything that would inflict permanent damage. Nor had they used this particular type of poison before. Then again, like Ino said, this wasn't strictly speaking poison, but just an allergic reaction to some pollen. No wonder the anti-poison chakra technique had failed. His chakra was barely responding at all. Heck, that fireball should have been enough to set the whole area ablaze, but as it was, some of the fires were already starting to die out. He saw movement. He moved to recover his sword and dove towards it as fast as he could, using his chakra to boost his speed as much as he could. He hadn't been this slow since he was at the academy. Once he had his weapon back, he started to hunt her down. She'd better have an antidote, the Uchiha growled under his breath. He stopped when she suddenly appeared before him. And she was already in a ready stance, her chakra primed and had just finished the last seal for her mind transfer jutsu. Simple enough to evade, made easier as his Sharingan allowed him to see the chakra of the technique as it moved through the air and, wait? What was happening? A hard ga. Sasuke's whole body had locked up and he couldn't move at all. The paralysis? Already? Impossible. What is this? He grated out through clenched teeth. Moments into the paralysis, 2 giant hands came from either side of him through the shadowed foliage and grabbed him tight. Tilting his head as far back as he could, with his Sharingan still active, he saw 2 familiar chakra signatures. Shikamaru and Choji. Of course. It all made sense now. They had him trapped with their ridiculous Ino-Shikacho combination. If he hadn't been infected with that death blossom pollen, he wouldn't have even been caught. Thinking back on it now, he realized right from the beginning he'd been facing the entire Team 10 the whole time. The boulder that had nearly crushed him twice, Choji. The one throwing things from the shadows and getting him turned around and that now had him paralyzed, Shikamaru. And all the while distracting him from the primary threat. He'd underestimated Ino. It wouldn't happen again. Before he could do anything about that, however, he felt something, like a physical hit but different. And suddenly he wasn't in control of anything anymore. Ino was in his mind. What do you hope to accomplish with this? You're still working with that traitor, Shikamaru, I saw him. I won't forget, and then you'll be the newest resident of the IT division, he thought said to her. Traitor? His own voice and mouth said with derision, that's rich, coming from you, Sasuke-kun. As for the rest, well, yes, actually you will forget. But don't worry, you'll still win our little match. Even have memories of using that new jutsu of yours successfully. Chidori-sanban, quite clever. Now let's see what else we can glean from your mind before we conclude our sparring match. Tangoku. Mabry lurched in his seat as the wagons fell with a thump into the firm clouds at the entrance to Tangoku. He didn't like coming up the wind tunnel in the wagons. A few of the less sturdy ones would undoubtedly break their axles in the landing. Once again he swore he'd talk to Jiraiya about that. There had to be a way to use the teleportation bands that they were making to also move large items. He moved out of the way as more wagons came up the tunnel. Finally, as the last one came up, he saw the tender fly up the wind tunnel, each landing perfectly. He motioned them over. You did an excellent job on this trip. I'll be sure to let Tenchi know. Your mission is officially over, so go get some rest. The 4 tender looked at each other and grinned. They whooped and raced off into the town. Mabry smiled. He imagined it was quite an accomplishment, successfully completing your first mission. He glanced back at the wagons rolling into the village. Only 2 had broken wheels from the landing. The cloud bank was soft yet firm enough to snap weaker wheels. But they were all glad to be home. He'd brought a few new faces, but he didn't think Naruto would mind. Nagi watched the wagons roll past him. His mind was far off, lingering on the dreams that haunted his sleep. He was not paying attention to the people in the wagons, but a gasp from one of them startled him out of his reverie. "Oh my W! My lord?" A very old woman that Nagi did not recognize was staring at him slack-jawed, her hand partially covering her mouth. Her eyes showed knowledge and fear? "No," she went on. "It cannot be." Nagi held up his hands. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You have me mistaken for someone else." The woman dropped her hands and regained her composure. She climbed down from the wagon she was on and shuffled slowly over to Nagi. She looked him in his eyes intently, causing Nagi to blush out of embarrassment. She grabbed his palm and glanced at it, though no more than a second. "You are who you are, my lord." She fell to her knees. "I failed your mother and your father, but finally I may find peace." She held out something to a shocked Nagi. It was a small curved dagger that seemed oddly familiar to him. She tilted her head back. "You have the right of Sasuke. Please take my life as penance for my failures." Nagi stared at her, then the knife, then back to her. "What?" Senji swung his legs off the bed, groaning and rubbing his chest. He yawned and looked over at the next bed. Naruto was gone, probably out training again. His body ached, covered in bruises and small cuts. He winced, feeling the soreness where a few ribs were clearly cracked. Tsunade had made it exceedingly clear that he was not to leave the hospital until she gave permission. So of course he was sneaking out right now. He grinned recklessly and reached for his swords, ignoring the pain and discomfort. Senji considered himself a real swordsman, and would go nowhere without his swords. Especially not after he almost died earning them in the sands of Wind Country. His fingers touched the hilt, and he felt an electric jolt race up his arm, into his spine and coursing through his whole body. Senji screamed silently, no sound escaping his throat as his back arched, and he fell convulsing onto the bed. Just as quickly as it happened, it was over. Senji lay there for a few minutes, fighting to regain his composure. He blinked, feeling the dryness of his eyes. "Thank Kami I didn't relieve myself right here." He sat up again and looked at his swords. They weren't booby-trapped. He'd have known. And who'd want to put a trap on his swords? He reached out hesitantly again and paused halfway. He looked down at his arm, the arm that a few minutes ago was covered in bruises and cuts. The skin was near flawless. He looked at his other arm, and that one was healed as well. Puzzled Senji felt his ribs, still a little soreness, but it didn't have the distinctive pinch of cracked ribs. So, the swords healed me? Senji stared at the cursed weapons for a minute, then snatched them in his hands quickly. This time he felt nothing, not even a tingle. With a grin and a short laugh he burst through the hospital window and headed for the training ground. He'd keep the sword's healing ability quiet, maybe try to figure out how it worked, or at least the limits of it. But for right now, it just meant he could train. Naruto walked past the wagons as they rolled in. He waved to various merchants as they passed him. He was glad they all seemed to be back safely. "Naruto!" He turned to see who was calling him and stood rooted in place, shock written on his face. "Naruto!" Ayame and Itachi were walking over to him. The old man and his daughter from Naruto's favorite, and only, ramen stand in Konoha. He remembered all the years they were the only ones aside from the Hokage that showed him a smile. He grinned at seeing them, confused as to how they came to be there. They approached him and Itachi put out his hand for a handshake. Naruto took it in disbelief that they were actually there. Ayame smiled at him warmly. "What are you guys doing here? How did you get here?" Naruto asked. "We petitioned Mabry to let us come," Ayame answered. "Father and I left Konoha when you rescued Irika. We headed as far east as we could, looking for somewhere out of the reach of Danzo. A friend of Father's recommended we go to that valley. We were expecting Jiraiya, but Mabry allowed us to come to Tangoku, on the condition that you have to approve of us." Itachi made a grunt. A tough man, that Mabry. "If you don't approve of us staying here," he said, "he'll toss us off the side of the island. Something about if we were Danzo's spies or something." Naruto shook his head. "No. Of course you can stay." He grinned, opening his arms wide. Welcome to my new home, and yours. Tucci and I smiled back. Now we just need to find a place to open our stand and to live. Mabry said we should find someone called Tenchi, or even Jiraiya. They would help us with allocating a space. Naruto frowned and shook his head. No. I know exactly where you can set up shop. Follow me. He walked back towards the tower, his two friends from Konoha in tow. They passed all the shops, and at the very center of town was a large empty building. Across the street was a flag with a wolf on it in a building of similar but grander size. Across the fountain at the center of the town was the academy, and on the other side Mabry's orphanage. Right here, Naruto said matter-of-factly. This building is yours now. It has 2 floors, and any construction you need. He made a quick sign and 5 clones popped into existence. My clones will help you renovate. Tucci studied the building intently. This is too much, Naruto. It's too grand for a simple noodle stand. Nonsense. Naruto smiled broadly. You're my friends. This is yours. I'll let the council know. Ayam touched her father's arm and wiped a tear from her eyes. It had been a hard journey for them. Abuse in Konoha before they abandoned their life there. The long trek across the world. Finally coming to the whispered Tangoku where Naruto was said to rule, hoping that he'd take them in. And now they had a new home. Silently she hugged Naruto, who smiled and blushed awkwardly. Thank you, our Tenshikage. Ayam said quietly. Just Naruto, he replied, his blush reaching his hair. Get up. Nagi said quietly and urgently. I'm not going to kill you. He practically begged the old woman to get up. He glanced at the knife she'd handed him like it was a snake in his hand. Her companions had come over and made no attempt to interfere. The 2 men were large and dark-skinned. Like her. Like Nagi. She stood shakily and stared at him with strong eyes. We will talk. Nagi nodded in disbelief and pointed down the street to the white tower. This way. Outside of Konoha, Shikamaru breathed in deep. He squeezed his eyes shut and snapped them open. His eyes blacker than the shadow he was sitting in. It had taken a long time for him to figure out the way. But now he could see it. See the shadow clearly. He understood now, the shadow had to be part of him. It wasn't a thing to be manipulated. It was he who had to change. His shadow sat in front of him, a solid thing. It looked right back at him, mirroring his every movement. He opened his arms wide and beckoned. The shadow became less solid. Tendrils of it reached out and leaked slowly into him. Shikamaru felt every pore in his skin open, allowing the shadow in. Silently, slowly. After a few minutes the jutsu was complete. He breathed again, feeling it inside him. Time to dance with the Jack Ashidos, he whispered to himself. He closed his eyes again and melted into the darkness, his body disappearing like smoke. Shino stood on the roof of the cave staring down at the ground. Well, where he assumed the ground was. It was so dark in the cave and so far below him that he couldn't even see it. He kept his concentration though. He'd been standing on the roof for so long that he'd lost track of time. If he had to guess though, he'd think it was a couple hours. The point of this exercise was to get his chakra controlled to the point where it was second nature. He needed to embrace the queen's guidance. I see you are still there. Her voice in his head was sweet and overpowering. His Kikai bugs buzzed in excitement. Yes, my queen, he thought back. Good. I am sending some drones. You will dispatch them, without moving from that spot. Shino heard the sound of legs running along the cave walls. 5? Maybe 10 drones? He held his hands in front of him. The queen did not allow him to use human weapons. The skittering got closer. The wolves glided through the long grass. This pack was strong, 10 full-grown males and females. Their padded feet brushed the grass, their ears peeled back against the wind. A new cub called to them. The voice echoing softly in their minds, calling to them. But different than normal. They raced to it just as much out of curiosity as out of brotherhood. Deep in their genetic memory, they remembered this type of wolf. Never had they seen one before. There. They picked up his scent. Turning with one mind, they moved like ghosts. The wolf cub was on a hunt. They could pick up the scent of a hated large cat. Wolves had their own name for everything. After a minute of running, they arrived at a clearing to see the new wolf cub circling the large cat. The cat was bigger than the cub by 2 lengths. Fangs bared, the cat sprang. The cub shifted its footing and caught the neck of the cat with a swipe of its paw, ripping its throat out. The wolves howled their appreciation of the kill. Off to the side was a large dog, watching the kill as well. The pack sent out a greeting to their distant cousin, and was pleased that the dog too was with the cub. Their pack would grow stronger. The leader reached out to the cub and welcomed him. Long had it been since a two-legged was also a wolf. The pack howled into the sky in jubilation. Kiba and Akamaru joined them. 1 mile from Tangoku, Jiraiya, Kakashi and Tenchi stood there, watching Naruto across the field. With a nod to them he formed 2 clones and immediately began forming a Rasengan. This one was a normal size, and his clones began moving their hands around the ball of chakra. After a few seconds the ball changed, its high-pitched whines sounding clear in the field. Small shuriken-like blades soon formed from the visible chakra. Kakashi nodded and made a clone of his own. His clone formed a Rasengan as well. Naruto's Rasengan whined louder, shone brighter. But they needed to test it. Naruto and Kakashi raced towards each other. There should have been a sound. A cataclysmic boom. But instead there was nothing. All noise disappeared. There was a white light that just grew. Jiraiya, the real Kakashi and Tenchi did not look away though. The Kakashi clone's Rasengan disintegrated when it hit Naruto's wind element Rasengan. After a few seconds the Rasengan dissipated. Naruto stood up and dusted off his clothes. He smiled across at the older men and waved. That went well. Chapter 26, Blood and Sand. Naruto, Nagi and Senji stared at the old woman incredulously. Mabry and Jiraiya, the only council elders in the room, just nodded as if she had confirmed something for them. The light thrown by the candles illuminating the room seemed to dance, adding to the surrealism of the moment. A prince? Nagi repeated quietly. That's impossible. Senji eyed the 2 large men flanking the old woman. They hadn't so much as uttered a single word, nor budged an inch when she spoke. If he didn't know better he'd swear they were statues. His hands flexed, ready to grip his swords in an instant. There was an air of extreme competence about them. They were clearly her bodyguards. Yes, my lord. You are the Crown Prince Najirai, of the Kingdom of Nubia, she repeated. I've never heard of Nubia. Senji interjected. Tsunade's eyes narrowed, taking Senji's body. The others in the room, being men, probably assumed he was just being strong and walking around after being seriously injured just yesterday. She, however, had some questions for the young warrior about what was clearly a miraculous recovery. Mabry shifted slightly. Nubia was its name 20 years ago. It was a land rich in gold and jewels. But because of that, people fought each other for every piece of land. Invasions, wars, and murders were commonplace. The ruler there quelled it all brutally, bathing the land in bodies and blood. So, it's now known to everyone as the Land of Blood. Nagi's eyes shifted from Mabry to the old lady, who nodded. Yes. Lord Shursho has been brutal in his putting down of any rebellions or invasions. But he himself is not the rightful ruler of Nubia. Your story, young Najirai, began 19 years ago in the palace of King Byajida. The land of Nubia was once a secure land. Yes, there was gold and jewels, but the king managed the land well, and all were content and taken care of. But the king had a cousin, Shursho, who wanted power. He plotted and schemed. The day of your birth, young prince, there was a massive feast, and the palace doors were open to all to pay respects to the new heir. Shursho saw his opening, and struck. His men were in disguise, mingled in with the ordinary citizens. It was a slaughter. The royal bloodline have always been masters of the way of shadows, but Shursho, bastard son of a royal and a foreigner, was a master of the way of fire. What his men did not destroy, he burned. The firstborn daughter of the king, your older sister, was amongst the first to die. She was a truly gifted shadow dancer. I, a maid in your mother's employ, saw her death with my own eyes as I was knocked cold by a falling beam. Beyond that we know very little. Shursho announced his rule, and the complete annihilation of your family was assumed. Shursho, for all his mastery of fire, was cold. Cold as death, as he lay claim to the land. His spirit infused the people and they soon turned on each other. The land of blood is rightly named. Nubia is no more. Nagi stared at the old woman, his eyes unblinking. His mind shut down, not knowing how to process any of what he heard. He went over it in his mind, no one daring to break the silence. Even Naruto stayed quiet, watching his friend. But why do you think I am this prince? He asked hesitantly. She frowned at him, annoyed. Think you I would not recognize the face of my true king and queen in their grown son? She made a vexed sound. If you require proof, I changed your bare behind and I know of the birthmark on your left cheek shaped like a dove. Nagi blushed while Naruto and Senji tried unsuccessfully to suppress their snickers. He looked up at his friends, and around the room. His head spinning, he lurched out of his chair and out the door, needing air. As Naruto and Senji went after Nagi, Mabry and Jiraiya watched them intently. Jiraiya looked back across at the old lady. What's your name? He asked. Everyone calls me Granny Sarah, she replied curtly. Okay, Granny Sarah, your bodyguard's there. Would you mind explaining them? I don't see an ex-maid needing, nor being able to have, two men like this. Granny Sarah laughed. My boys here? You'd begrudge a little old lady some protection in a world such as we live in? Mabry smiled. I know who you are, Granny. There was a reason I allowed you and your boys to come to Tangoku. We could use someone with your unique perspective of the world. And I must say, your boys look pretty handy too. She cackled again. I was wondering what game you were playing at Milford, Mabry. A man as traveled as you would hardly mistake me for anyone else. Young Jiraiya here suspects, but you would know. Jiraiya cocked his head, looking at Mabry, waiting for an explanation. Since we've been keeping track of history, centuries of it, there has been a Granny Sarah working for one royal family or the other. It's hard to miss stories of her, really. Jiraiya looked at the old woman anew. I have heard stories of such a person. How can this be? My secrets are my own, young Jiraiya. Smarter men than you have tried to figure me out. I have lived to see them return to dust. She stood up shakily. I have served countless families through the ages. This age saw me in the land of Nubia, serving a very worthy family. They treated me as a family member, not as an immortal which to be used or deferred to. I loved the queen like a daughter. Their death has blanketed me in sadness for these last 20 years. She looked out to where Nagi had left. Perhaps the time is coming when their spirits will find peace, and mine as well. Naruto, Nagi and Senji just stood on the balcony of the highest floor of the White Tower, staring out into the sky. The sun was setting, and its orange and red hues caught the facets on Gaara's mysterious beacon stone, perched higher still atop the tower. A prism of lights danced down on the sides of the tower, making it come alive in different colors. A soft, cool evening breeze blew at them, ruffling their hair. Even Nagi's shoulder-length dreadlocks shifted weightlessly. My first memory was in a slaver's pit. I was sold to a farmer in the unknown lands. An investment, he claimed. I don't remember him much, other than he was cruel to all. A man named Clark, another slave, took me and ran away one day. He was dark, like me. Not all the slaves were dark. I remember being dressed up that day, being bathed, and led up to the main house. The smell is what I remember most. Some sort of perfume they put on me. I must have been 6 by then. Maybe 7? Clark burst into the house and killed the owner. He took me and we ran. For a decade we ran. Clark taught me what he knew of capoeira. He didn't speak much. But we were a family, he and I. When he died, I was a leaf in the wind. Nagi turned to Naruto. You guys changed that. Changed me. You're my best friends, and the only family I have now. This, he pointed out to Tangoku, is my home now. He sighed and leaned against the railing. I didn't know my parents. I dream about them, I think. That dream I have, the fire, the fall. I think it's real. Senji nodded and put his hand on Nagi's shoulder. I don't want to be a prince. Or rule a kingdom. His eyes grew steely, a glint shining in them. But this Lord Shursho killed my mother, my father, my sister. Naruto and Senji stood silently, their muscles tensing. Nagi stood straight as an arrow. His voice like iron as he spoke. I will avenge them. The wind whistled, curving its way around them, seemingly embracing the moment. Naruto struggled internally with what he was about to say. They'd so far made Tangoku a place of justice. Not throwing their weight around against the weak. Not killing mindlessly. Would this push them in a direction they were not supposed to go? What was the difference between justice and vengeance? We will help, said Naruto quietly. Tenchi looked down at the new armbands Gaara had constructed according to Jiraiya's specifications. They were beautifully made, an intricate system of seals etched into soft silver. They tried again and again, and always the wearer, once activating the seals on the armband with an injection of chakra and a drop of blood, would be summoned to the great seal drawn into the courtyard of the White Tower. It would be invaluable to them on all future excursions off the island. Naruto's clones had mapped out every river leading off the island, but they'd still only found the one leading into it, and that was very close by. Any missions far away would mean that much longer before they could return. These would solve that problem. He looked up at Gaara. "Excellent work, my friend." Gaara nodded. "See, these came out acceptable." He glanced up at the sunset. "Perhaps tomorrow we can talk to Yoshi about these vanishing bricks of his." Tenchi smiled. "That Mad Hatter is incredible. Mabry's idea of what to do with those bricks is also a bit crazy, though." Gaara laughed, his deep bass resonating in the quiet evening. "See? Well, after all, a trading village that can vanish as the sun sets is something out of a legend. It will add to the mystique of Tangoku for sure." "Indeed, my friend." Sunagakure. Gaara looked out over the balcony of his palace at the citizens going about their everyday business. He could see a little girl laughing as she pointed into dress shops with her mother. He saw a group of boys playing football, and he, for a moment, flashed back to his own childhood memories. He ruthlessly suppressed them, though, not wanting to spiral down that path. Sleep still eluded him, even though the laughter in his head had been more subdued recently. Since the battle with Naruto that time, he'd been better able to control the one-tail inside him. People were slowly realizing he was not a danger to them. But there was still much doubt. Word of the war between Iwagakure and Konohagakure was still on the tip of everyone's tongues. The people of Sunagakure were a hard people, long accustomed to living in a harsh world. Every day was a fight for survival in the hot sands. Even so, Gaara did not want war to come to Suna. He did not think Emperor Danzo would strike any time soon. His own spies told him Danzo was recovering still from the IWA battle. And even with the inclusion of the IWA forces into his own, he was very busy joining those villages properly, and solidifying his base of operations. Gaara's advisors told him it would be a few years before Danzo was a real threat. And still there was the fact that one would be either a fool, or need to have unlimited resources to even attempt an attack on the ninja of Suna in their native environment when they had the advantage, and whose Kazekage could control the very ground they strode upon to get close enough to attack in the first place. But Gaara had his doubts it would be that long. For now, though, he was happy his people were living in relative peace. The treasure Naruto had found, the part Suna had kept for itself, was a sorely needed windfall. They'd been able to purchase better water filtration systems, and well-digging equipment. New cavernous farms were being built into the surrounding cliff sides. Suna grew a lot of its own food, but still imported too much for Gaara's comfort. He wanted the entire village to be self-sufficient. If war did come, they'd not have to worry about supplies. They could retreat into their village and lock down, hopefully outlasting any siege. An explosion to the north drew his attention away from his thoughts. A wry smile cracked his otherwise stoic face. The bull-haired teacher and his students were training harder than anyone had a right to in the desert heat. Especially for people who were unaccustomed to said heat. Gaara held out his hand and used his dice and no-mi jutsu. This one was the size of a ping-pong ball. He sent it soaring across towards where the sound was coming from. He'd been watching them with some curiosity since they'd begun their training, and he was astonished at their drive and camaraderie. Through his eye he saw the younger scary fashion sense one moving through a series of hard punches and blocks so fast he had a difficult time keeping up. From what he had observed from his own fight with Lee, he had no chakra skills to speak of. But when he removed his weights or opened his gates, his speed and strength were beyond comparison. It was a clever compensation for what would otherwise be a crippling weakness in a ninja. For now, Lee's weights were on still and his hand movements were a blur. Gaara could not help but be impressed. Likewise for the girl Hinata. Her movements weren't as sharp or hard as Lee's were. Hers were elegant almost. She flowed from hit to hit, blocking Lee's attacks while seeming to move at half his speed. Gaara couldn't figure out the flow. It was like Lee was punching water, but the water just flowed around his punches and tried to strike back. It was a beautiful dance. But that wasn't what had created the thunderous noise that had drawn his attention. Mato Guy was sparring with Niji, and if he didn't know better, Gaara would swear he was trying to kill him. Niji was spinning in his ultimate defense, while Guy punched and kicked. Gaara saw a side kick that connected with a boom, and literally shifted Niji's defensive circle 5 feet to the left, kicking up dirt and stone as he moved. To his credit, Niji kept his circle going. Gaara withdrew his eye, having seen enough for today. The intense training of the Konoha was inspiring his own ninja to step up their own pursuits. His siblings were off practicing as well. Gaara himself had never felt the need to train. His perfect defense had always protected him against every attack. He was a pure chakra user, not ever bothering with taijutsu of any kind. But he had to admit it was something he should consider. His best comparison was Naruto. Naruto was more powerful than he was. Gaara could admit that. Naruto didn't have Gaara's control necessarily, but in raw power, the 9 tails beats the 1 tail any day. But even Naruto used other skills besides chakra attacks. He'd heard many stories of Naruto over the past year, and even from seeing him in person, he knew that his friend was growing stronger and stronger. It was still weird for Gaara to think he had an actual friend. But it fit, the two of them, bound together by the creatures within them. "We have a delivery by Hawk my Kazakage." Baki approached from across the room holding a small package. "From whom?" Gaara asked without even turning around. "From Jiraiya. Seems they've come up with a seal object for us to communicate with Tengoku." He pulled out a small scroll and a perfectly round stone with engravings all around it. "These are instructions on how to use it. It seems easy enough. Blood-triggered jutsu, and a simple message gets sent immediately to the holder of the other stone. I assume that's Jiraiya. The scroll says this is a prototype. Only we and Wave have been sent these." Gaara looked over at the rock curiously, then back out the window. "What troubles you, my lord?" Gaara glanced at him, not realizing he'd shown his thoughts on his face. "I have been considering learning more techniques," he said thoughtfully, still picturing the training Konoha. Baki nodded. "It does seem like everyone is training harder and harder. I would offer to teach you myself, but my expertise is in air attacks. I have no skill in sand. There is one, though, who may be willing." Gaara looked up curiously. "Maybe?" Baki laughed. "The old fool prefers to spend his days fishing with his sister. But as far as sand users go, Ebizo was always the master. In his day, he could control sandstorms and shift the ground itself. Even though he did prefer using his mind than his skills." Gaara sighed in recognition. "Ah, Ebizo. And his sister Chio. He looked off towards the sound of another boom coming from the Konohanin's training area. "I will go to him." Wave country. Asuma crested the hill and looked out towards the sea. It had been a harrowing journey, and he'd not known what to expect when he got here, but it certainly hadn't been this. The land of waves had once looked like a sleepy little fishing village. Not anymore. Several tall stone buildings were being erected, ringing the island. A giant warship flying the flag of the Crescent Moon Kingdom was docked just offshore. The Great Naruto Bridge was heavily barricaded, every inch of it blockaded with physical obstacles and chakra traps. He spied a group of men on the near bank moving stones onto a barge and approached cautiously. He had removed his Konoha headband and changed his clothes before, and was grateful now. They would not likely be welcoming to a Konohanin right about now. As he got nearer, Asuma realized the group was comprised of 10 workers and 2 guards. He was now picking up snippets of their conversation. Takada could be in a tavern, talking to the most beautiful girl in the world. Takada loves her straw-colored hair and her plump behind. Instead, where is Takada? Watching men lift rocks. A tall man with spiky black hair was musing out loud. "Shut it, fool." A short, bald man covered in tattoos scowled at him. "You think I want to be here either? This is the job. And goddammit to almighty heaven, would you stop talking in third person?" The tall one, Asuma now knew was Takada, sighed. "Masahiro does not understand. Her rump is the plumpest in the 9 kingdoms. And Takada is a rump man. I'll give you that, it's a nice tuchus, Takada." Masahari smirked. "I bet Mizurai is keeping her company right now." Takada growled. Takada would not like that very much. Asuma saw his fingers clench around something he couldn't quite make out as yet. As he cleared some more trees, though, he realized it was the biggest meat cleaver sword he'd ever seen. "Not much at all." "Relax, idiot," Masahiro said with a laugh. "Mizurai is teaching at our little school for warriors today." Asuma was now within sight, and the men looked over at him. He sensed the spike in chakra from both Takada and Masahari. Takada sees no paths of conflict. Takada said quietly. No aggressiveness. Although the way he moves indicates high probability that he is a ninja disguised as a civilian. Who are you and what do you want? Masahari said. The men had stopped moving the stones and Asuma realized each was holding their pickaxes tightly. My name is Asuma, and I've come seeking asylum. Konoha. Danzo sat silently behind the curtain, surrounded by darkness, the only illumination in the room that of the 4 candles in formation directly across from the Emperor's line of sight. All an allusion to the kings and emperors of old. The one he had been waiting on finally arrived, escorted in by the remainder of his elite guard. He was already training Lizard's replacement, but it would be years before he would be ready. Until then, he only had his 3 left, and he was keeping them close. Yosh. Emperor Sama, you are looking most youthful this fine day. Meito Gai exclaimed the moment he was placed within the circle of illumination. Danzo frowned, not that anyone could see with the precautions he had put in place, and snapped at the so-called green beast of Konoha, Gai. Do you understand why you are here? Why I pulled you out of Suna? Do you understand why you were replaced and your students taken from you? By one of your own students even. Do you comprehend the truth behind all that? Gai grinned that insufferable smile of his. At least they'd kept that mini-guy away. Danzo swore he'd never seen a more terrifying illusion than that, whatever it was Gai and Lee got up to with the sunset, the waves, and the... Danzo shivered, forcing the images from his mind. Again, not that anyone could see him. Thanks to the jutsus on the screen, all they saw was a dark, imposing shadowed silhouette, and nothing more. Yosh. Indeed I do, Emperor Sama. A most youthful decision indeed. Niji was indeed ready for such a heavy responsibility, as I could see when he arrived to relieve me of my youthful duties. His flames of youth were burning more brightly than ever before. I can only hope to do as good a job the second time around. Gai was now openly crying, his fist covering his face. If he was the sort, Danzo would have sweat dropped. Instead, he growled out, You think that I recalled you to give you a second genin team to train? Yosh. Gai just grinned, tears gone like they'd never been. He was taking all the fun out of this. Fine then. If he thought he was here to be given more students to train, then might as well make the most out of it. Besides, the candles had had more than enough time to do their job. Danzo couldn't help but marvel at his own genius when he considered the many levels of security he was under right now. Besides all 3 of his elite guard being in the room, hidden in the shadows, there were another 4 layers of security. The first were the candles. They were specially designed by a clan in IWA ironically, so that the smoke from the candles disrupted all illusions, whether it be genjutsus or a transformation. Even physical transformations were, while not dispelled, identified by a clear glow coming from the skin, visible only once the transformed person left the circle of light. The next level of security was the screen. It was riddled with enough seal work that sometimes he got a headache just looking at it. Suffice it to say, it stopped all projectiles, both physical and chakra-based, obscured whoever and whatever was behind it so they were nothing more than an indistinguishable silhouette, while on the other side they were allowed to see everything like it was noon on the top of a mountain made of crystal glass. It wasn't the Byakugan or Sharingan, but it was the next best thing for those without such advantages. The last 2 layers of security were what Danzo was activating now. In the space between the candles and the curtain, there was a pressure plate. So long as Danzo applied pressure to the counterplate, the lethal darts wouldn't turn whoever was standing on said pressure plate into a poison-filled pincushion. The last was a bolt hole directly behind and below Danzo, hidden by the very platform he sat upon. The Emperor of Earth and Fire was under no illusions about Meito Gai's abilities. The man was as fast, if not faster, and definitely stronger than Kakashi had ever been. If anyone could dodge the darts and make it past the screen, and avoid the attacks of his guards, it would be Meito Gai. Not that Danzo truly believed the naive Jounin capable of assassination in the first place, but after Naruto's attack and subsequent escape, he wasn't taking chances anymore. Come forward, Meito-san. I do indeed have a new purpose for you here in Konoha. That is close enough, he said once Gai was on the pressure plate. For the moment, Danzo kept the pressure on the counterplate. Orochimaru was saying it would be some time before the first of the new breed of soldiers would be ready. And for right now, he needed every able body that he had. Even those of questionable use. At least he could be certain that the man before him was Meito Gai. Outside of the candlelight, He was as dark as Danzo himself was to the eyes of others. If he'd been under a transformation of any kind, he would be glowing like a wraith out of a child's scary story. I'm assigning you to the prison, Guy. I'm sure all those lonely prisoners there will greatly enjoy your fires of youth. Danzo restrained a chuckle from leaving his lips. If only the fool knew that he was actually being sent there as a prisoner rather than to watch the other prisoners. Flames. What? What was that? Danzo was confused. He was sure he just felt a chakra spike from the normally demure, yet overenthusiastic Jounin. It is flames of youth. Guy exulted, and the chakra spike rose unbelievably high in an incredibly short amount of time. In less than 10 seconds, Guy had just opened 7 of the 8 gates. The Root Elite Guard that were the first line of Danzo's defense immediately surged forward from the shadows, using the ninja teleport to cross the short distance that much quicker. Guy had already been moving before they'd even fully materialized. GKI, Konoha Kongariki Senpu! He shouted as he spun around in his released gate state. All 3 bodyguards were knocked back through the walls and ceiling of the room, none of them having a chance against the powerful close-range taijutsu attack. Before Danzo could so much as open his mouth to demand what the man was doing, the green beast got into an unfamiliar pose. Despite the sight augmentation of the sealed screen, all Danzo could see of it was that Guy had put his palm facing outward before his face and brought his other fist around in front of it. If not for the shadows and obscuring haze of chakra, Danzo was certain that he would see Guy's skin was a burning red. With no more warning than Guy forming a half of a tiger seal with his palmed hand, the room was suddenly filled with a paralyzing air pressure wave that knocked Danzo off his pedestal, but also kept all the poison darts from actually hitting as well as keeping the trapdoor to his escape shut even as Guy punched through the protective screen. Hiradora! Guy shouted the name of his technique, and the last thing Danzo saw before he dematerialized was the image of a giant tiger's face coming right at him to devour him whole. Danzo rematerialized right behind Guy and wasted no time in putting a Chidori through the green beast's back, only to discover at the last possible moment that he'd instead put it through the corpse of a man he'd never seen before. He let the limp body of the would-be assassin fall to the ground, blood pooling at his feet. He swore mightily, having wasted one of his precious eyes. The door flew open and a small swarm of guards entered at full alert. Take this garbage away. He moved back to his desk. He didn't know how this assassin had used Guy's techniques. But no matter. The Jounin had not returned from Sunagakure. Either he was involved in the assassination attempt, or he was dead. Regardless of which, Danzo ordered Mato Guy be put in the bingo book as an A-rank criminal. The crime, high treason and attempted assassination of the Emperor of Fire and Earth. Tangoku, this is a most excellent training exercise. Noik chimed in happily as he got up and picked up an empty backpack. He shuffled over to his tea case and began selecting very specific ones for his journey. No, 1,000 times no, Nagi said frantically. This isn't training. I'm going to avenge my parents' death. I'm going to kill this man. It's a very big deal. Noik nodded. Indeed it is. A student of mine is going out on his first task, even though it is a childishly simple one, since beginning his training with the master of Zenanju. I must ensure that you do not embarrass me too greatly. He glanced at Nagi pitifully. As difficult as that may be, however. Nagi gave it up and looked hopelessly to Calamity. She just smirked at him, having told him this would not end well. Noik clucked his tongue in annoyance. You young ones are just sitting there dawdling. When there is a task to be done, it's best to be about it earliest. I expect you ready in 1 hour to leave. Noik. It's not just us going. Calamity chimed in. Both boys and girls teams are going. Cha! Noik exclaimed. Am I to be a babysitter then in my dying years? He kept placing things neatly into his pack. But that means too that Lord Naruto will also be going? He inquired. Yes, master. Nagi replied. Then the chance for Noik's embarrassment is now greater. If Lord Tenshikage sees you performing poorly in the battlefield, this will be impossible to hide. Noik will be shamed forever. He looked at the both of them with steely eyes, waiting for a response. We will not shame you, master, both Nagi and Calamity said in unison. Noik sighed and shrugged. Alas, poor Noik's fate and honor is now in the hands of an earthworm and a woman. Which is worse? He resumed packing. 1 hour. Sakura and Hiroka stood packed and ready, waiting just inside the White Tower. Sakura adjusted her new armband with the symbol for Tengoku on it. These were the new bands that allowed them to be summoned back home. She glanced over at her friend and teammate Hiroka. The two of them had been training together as much as possible since Calamity had been tied up with Nuik. But on evenings they all got together to hang out and talk about their day. They'd become her best friends and confidants. So she knew something was bothering Hiroka. "What's on your mind?" she asked. Hiroka adjusted her band as well, and touched her hair. A sign Sakura knew that she was thinking. "This is a chance for me to spend some time with Senji. I mean, we haven't had a lot of time what with all the training. We've spoken but, not alone. I think he's still avoiding me as much as he can," Hiroka said embarrassingly. "Maybe. From what you said I don't think he thinks he's worthy, not since his teacher was killed. But I've told him I don't care," Hiroka said exasperatedly. "I know men have their honor but he's just pig-headed." Sakura laughed. "Yes, I know a couple of very pig-headed boys." Tsunade walked into the room, glancing at the two of them. "Where's Calamity?" "She's coming. She went with Nagi to let Master Nuik know they were going. Across the village." "You're at a critical stage, young Naruto," Toad said with immense aggravation in his voice. Naruto smiled and scratched the back of his head. "Yeah, I know, Pa. But I've gotta do this. I will leave really strong clones behind to continue my training though. That is not the same. Your strongest clones cannot channel natural chakra you are able to. It's the best I can do, Pa. I have to do this with my friends." Pa scoffed. "Well, go then. But don't blame me if you blow up." He hopped off in a huff, leaving Naruto standing awkwardly with Toad. "Don't mind him, Naruto. I think he's going to miss having you as a pupil while you're gone." She smiled at him. "Please be careful, dear." Naruto grinned at Ma and ran off towards the tower to pack. An hour later Nagi stood facing his friends. Naruto, Senji, Sakura, Calamity and Hiroka stood facing him, all packed lightly for the journey. Each wore a grim, determined expression on their face. He was overwhelmed by their show of support. He'd never had anything like this in his life. A family as much as it was. And here they were going without question to help him avenge a family he never knew. Behind the group of 10 stood Nuik, unmoving as a statue. He was looking over the group with a keen eye, missing nothing, especially Naruto. If Nagi didn't know better, he thought he saw the faintest hint of respect on his face, but he had to be imagining it. None of the older heads were coming for the mission, but they were there to see them off regardless. Mabry and Yoshi were going to be working on the new vanishing trading village. Old Man Tora, Tenchi and Gaara were still teaching the academy students. Inari and his friends were back in classes, albeit more advanced ones. Ali and his clan were apparently preparing for something as well, something that was rather hush-hush. There had been some whispers in the village, ranging from an election for best thief in the world to a decade annual plundering games that the clan was hoping to win. Tsunade looked over the group. In Naruto's absence, it was agreed that each of the older generation would take turns leading the village. This time it was Tsunade's turn. She scowled unhappily. "Our two best, and only, teams going out on a single mission. That we're not even being paid for. We could just send one team," she grumbled. Mabry whispered to her. "Yes, we could, but you're wrong. There are numerous bounties on the head of Lord Shursho of the Land of Blood. I will be making contact with various parties before Naruto and the teams even reach the country. So this should be fairly profitable for us." He glanced over at the young teams. "Besides, they need to do this." Tsunade shook her head, whispering back. "I know." Nagi cleared his throat and opened his mouth, wanting to say something to his friends. Something to convey how he felt having them all at his back. A few seconds passed with them looking at him. A few seconds more. He smiled sheepishly. Thanks guys." Naruto grinned back and shouted. "As a good friend of mine says, let's go ignite our flames of youth." They headed for the airstream that would take them into Blood Country. Sunagakure. Deidara eyed the tall cliffs ahead that denoted the entrance to Sunagakure. He scowled, wiping the dripping sweat from his brow. This heat was more than he bargained for. Indeed, this whole trip was more agonizing than he would have liked. For one, his partner in this venture was not the most talkative. Except when it came time to deride his art. Sasori had no respect for Deidara's clay sculpture bombs. He didn't see the artistry involved in the explosions, The sheer majesty of force and fire. The beauty to be found in the brief moment of a blazing blast. They came to a stop and he looked quizzically at Sasori. The oddly shaped spy master said he had someone on the inside who would enable them to enter the almost impregnable citadel. Deidara didn't really care though. He would just as easily have flown over the walls on one of his clay birds and just challenged Gaara. All this subterfuge bored him. Like his explosions, he was not subtle. Sasori made a small movement and shifted in the sand. It is done. Now we wait. It won't be long, he said. Deidara stood still, his fingers itching, the tension beginning to be replaced by excitement. Soon he would rain death and destruction down. They would soon capture the one-tail host. Niji noticed him first. The Sunanin was moving in a brisk manner past their training area. But that wasn't what alerted him. It was the blood. He turned quickly to the others. Sensei. That jounin over there has blood on him, he said quietly to Mado Guy. Guy's eyes narrowed as he caught just a glimpse of the figure before he disappeared from sight. He's headed towards the gates. It may be nothing, but we can make it a training exercise if it is. With a signal they leapt after the sand ninja, trailing him. It wasn't long before they arrived at the guarded entrance to Sunagakure proper. The jounin seemed to be known amongst the other guards and he walked right up to one. Guy was about to call off their trailing him when they saw the jounin plunge a dagger into the unsuspecting guard. He lowered the guard and moved on into the defended walls, undoubtedly to repeat his murder within. Guy wasted no time. Hinata. Alert Baki and Gaara. Hinata nodded and disappeared in a flash. Niji, get to a vantage point. The only reason to disable guards is to allow an invasion. I didn't think Danzo would be so bold, but get up high and tell me what's going on. Meet us at the main gate. Niji leapt up, climbing the cliffs quickly. I will eliminate that jounin. Lee raced into the defended walls after the murderous spy, only to be stopped by Guy's hand on his shoulder. No, Lee. You and Tenten, head for the main gate. I will meet you there in 5 minutes. Guy seemed a blur as he took off into the tunnels. Lee nodded and bent over as he clicked off his weights, resting them on the ground. With a nod to Tenten, they headed towards the main gates. Guy caught up to the jounin after finding 2 more bodies. The spy didn't even have time to turn around as Guy's 2-finger thrust crushed the top of his spine, severing it completely, and forever paralyzing the man. He fell in a heap on the ground, crying out in pain. Guards! Guy then shouted out. Within seconds 3 armed Chunin appeared. They were taken aback by the fallen jounin at Guy's feet. They were about to attack him when he held up his hands. He was a spy. He killed 3 guards on the way here. See the truth for yourself. He pointed to the blood-stained dagger in the jounin's hand and the body of another guard a few paces back. An attack must be coming. Prepare. He raced outside to meet his students, leaving 3 very confused guards behind. Baki saw the girl Konohanin bounding towards them. Her manner and speed spoke of an emergency. He wondered for a second how she found him, but figured her eyes could pick out Gaara's chakra from a mile away. He glanced back towards Gaara, who was deep in conversation with the 2 retired council members. He frowned. It looked like it was going well. Pity. Whatever this emergency was would interrupt their discussion. Hinata arrived seconds later. A Suna jounin was killing guards at the entrance. Sensei asked me to alert you. Baki looked at her for a second, eyes squinting, his mind working overtime. Initial doubt over the trustworthiness of a Konohanin was dismissed quickly. He knew these ninja. An attack on the guards could only mean one thing. He turned quickly. Kazukage. We are under attack. The main wall. Guy arrived at the same time as Lee and Tenten. Niji bounded down a second later. There are 2 men out there. No army that I could see. Both wearing dark robes with red clouds on them. Guy gave a start. He had expected maybe Danzo, but not this. Akatsuki. He glanced at his pupils. They were not ready to face this threat. We will wait for backup. Deidara was growing impatient. It's been half an hour, Sasori. Can we just go, please? Sasori made an annoyed sound. Yes, it has been too long. My spy must have failed. He turned to Deidara. You're free to do what you want. Just draw out the one-tail. Deidara grinned madly. He reached into his pouches and with a few quick motions formed a giant clay bird. He hopped on its back and it took off, towards the cliff and the city on the other side. He was within feet of the cliff when he realized he was meeting no resistance at all. Not even a shout of alarm at the giant bird attacking. He sensed rather than saw a threat approaching him, and his gut told him to swerve, which he did. An explosion rocked the spot his bird was a second earlier, the force almost making him lose his footing. The bird adjusted its flight. He glanced down and saw a group of ninja on top of the cliff. A girl was smiling up at him. She ran towards another boy. Either of them looked much like Sunanin, who heaved her high into the air at incredible velocity. She was flying almost straight at him, almost. He watched in morbid curiosity as she reached the peak of her ascent. When she was just about parallel with him, she made some fast signs and huge scrolls were unraveled. Before he knew it, a storm of knives, shuriken, kunai, and anything sharp and pointy were flying towards him. An unbelievable amount of weaponry. He pulled the bird up, letting the majority of the sharp weapons embed themselves harmlessly in the clay of the bird. He laughed at the stupidity and naivety of the attack. He glanced at her and saw her waving and smiling as she fell back to earth. With a curse he leapt off the bird just as the hundreds of exploding tags attached to the kunai and shuriken detonated. They both hit the ground at roughly the same time, landing as well as their chakra-enhanced legs would allow. Sasori was making his way into the entrance when he saw Deidara's bird go up in smoke, so to speak. He cursed inwardly. The fool could do nothing right. A figure stepped in front of him, a figure he recognized. Baki had long been known as one of the most feared jounin in Sunagakure. His wind attacks and sword skills were legendary. But even he was worried as he realized the man facing him was an S-rank missing nin from his own village. "Stop right there, Sasori of the Red Sand!" Baki shouted clearly. An almost inaudible gasp was heard from somewhere behind him. "Ah, you know me then. Tell me before this goes further. What happened to my spy? I had hoped to do this without so much fanfare." "The traitor Yura was killed. Turn yourself in, Sasori, and face your crimes," Baki replied, his voice steely. Sasori saw no need to talk further, so he attacked, his odd shell-shaped racing towards Baki, who unleashed a cutting wind attack from his sword. Sasori dodged it easily, and his cloak fluttered in the wind as a tail whipped out from beneath it and arced towards the jounin. Baki blocked it and tried to cut it, but the tail moved at inhuman speed with great precision. Within seconds of the clash, it had impaled his left shoulder, forcing him to drop his sword. With a curse, Kankuro leapt out into the fray, directing his new puppet salamander between Sasori and Baki. Sasori withdrew his tail and looked quizzically at Kankuro. Kankuro launched Crow at Sasori, his arms reaching for the oddly shaped man. As the puppet got close, its mouth dropped open and a deadly gas enveloped the invading missing nin. Sasori laughed, and his tail smashed through Crow. With a spin it ripped apart the puppet to the dismay of Kankuro. "I was wondering what became of these. It's been many years since I've had a chance to play with my old creations. You handle them with some skill, young man." Kankuro swore violently. He knew the legend of Sasori of the Red Sands, the master puppeteer of Suna. He'd not realized that Sasori had also built the puppets he was now using. That would mean that he knew all of their built-in tricks. He filed that away for future thought. He'd have to come up with new tricks on his puppets, and not rely so heavily on already constructed traps. Sasori waited for him to make a move. Kankuro directed Salamander to attack, the large puppet stomping towards Sasori, its own tail hopefully a match for Sasori's. He also unleashed Black Ant in a combined attack. The puppet's attacks were however anticipated and avoided, or blocked. Sasori's tail kept taking chunks out of Salamander, which Kankuro was using mostly for defense, while Black Ant was for offense. After a furious few minutes, Sasori had disabled both puppets and leapt towards Kankuro. Other Sunanin leapt out in defense, but it was too late. He released a poison gas on them and landed safely on the other side. He headed into the city, hearing the sounds of gurgling as the Sunanin outside died slowly. Kankuro felt the effects of the poison creeping through his body. He'd been building up his immunities to poison ever since he began puppet training. That was an important skill to have. But this was Sasori, and that meant an unknown poison. He heard the sounds of his fellow ninja dying and cursed in his mind his ineffectiveness against Sasori. He would last longer than the others, but he knew he was dying. He closed his eyes as the convulsions began. Deidara was having a hard time of it. The weapons girl had teamed up with another girl with a giant fan. Their combination of wind attacks and a never-ending barrage of weapons was effectively neutralizing his bombs. Before he could get anything impressive going, he was forced to dodge and avoid. Their plan seemed to be to not let up until they'd killed him. Normally that would be a good plan. He ran straight at them, ducking and weaving, avoiding every attack that they threw at him. With a burst he launched at them. Tenten and Temari were taken by surprise at his frontal attack, and therefore were not expecting it when suddenly Gaara exploded. They were blown backwards and bounced painfully on the dirt, unconscious. Gaara burst out of the ground, grinning and laughing maniacally. He turned to go towards the village when the sand around him shifted suddenly, and he was enveloped in a coffin of sand. He barely had time to register the voice before the sand crushed him into a clump of dead meat and dripping blood. Gaara looked with distaste at the remains of the Akatsuki member, before glancing over anxiously towards his fallen sister. A medical ninja nodded at him and motioned for others to bring stretchers. Knowing she was okay, Gaara calmed down considerably. There was one more invader. He went looking for him. Konoha morgue. Kisaragi Saemon waited until he was sure that there was no one else in the room. His time with Jiraiya had not been wasted. While the spy master could very well have turned him into the perfect spy or the perfect assassin, given the time and resources, they did not in fact have the time or resources. So, in the 2 weeks that Kisaragi had with the Toad Sannin, Jiraiya had made it a priority to teach him exactly 2 jutsu. Everything else that he would need to know or learn, he was assured his bloodline limit would take care of it for him. The first was the Kawarimi no Jutsus, the body switch technique. Jiraiya had trained him in it so thoroughly, and so well that he could now perform it without seals and barely more than a flicker of a chakra burst warning prior to the technique being used. The other, which is what had truly saved his life this day, was the ability to sense chakra attacks. He wasn't a chakra sensor, not by any stretch of the definition, but Jiraiya, Tsunade, and even Naruto himself a couple times, had worked with him until he could sense and dodge any large chakra attack made against him. Not dodge it completely, obviously, but dodge just enough and in just the right way so as to avoid being instantly killed. Yes, Danzo's counterattack had injured him, and badly, but he wasn't dead yet. Quietly, making as little noise as possible, the unknown assassin that Danzo had put a Chidori rolled himself off the table, doing his best not to shout out in pain, and made his way out of the morgue. He headed to his safe house as quickly and securely as possible, taking almost an hour to get there without being seen and without leaving any trail to follow. Once the door was close behind him and the curtains drawn, he collapsed on the bed oblivious to the world. Chapter 27, Dust to Dust. Sunagakure. Gaara's sand rose up in a perfect defense against the onslaught from Sasori. He tried to grab the scorpion-shaped man in his sand, but the Akatsuki member was faster than Gaara would have thought he could move. They'd been fighting for several minutes thus far and neither had landed a single attack. Sasori, however, didn't seem bothered by this, but instead rather amused. I see Sunagakure has chosen its next Kazekage well. Your mastery over sand is commendable. His scorpion tail lashed out and gouged a slice into the globe of hardened sand mostly encircling Gaara. Spikes of sand burst out of the ground, seeking to impale Sasori, but no avail. The puppet master was a blur avoiding the spikes. However, the cloth flap in front of Sasori's mouth fluttered and poisoned Saban flew towards Gaara. His perfect defense again leapt up around to protect him. As much as this visit home has entertained me, I really must be on my way. Let's see how much of a Kage you are. Sasori leapt high into the air, releasing seals after seals. In a cacophony of sound and smoke, 100 puppets seemed to levitate in the air. With a smirk he directed them to unleash their poison gases at once. A noxious cloud of purple gas settled high over the city. Gaara looked incredulously at the size of it, and then saw around him citizens running for shelter screaming. His eyebrows furrowed in anger, and he raised his hands. The very ground of all of Sunagakure was made of sand. Sand which Gaara now called on to rise. In a swirling stinging maelstrom of particles the ground itself erupted, spewing forth every inch of sand that covered the ground, and every building and object in the city. Straining, Gaara directed the sand to form up high above the city, coming together and solidifying, blotting out the sun. What is going on? Lee shouted to his sensei over the din. Mato Gai was peering to the battle between Gaara and Sasori. The Kazekage is protecting the city. The poison cloud will kill everyone if it lands. Temari and Baki, who was nursing the wound to his shoulder, looked at each other and leapt up, jumping from building to building. With a final superhuman leap, they got on top of the sand before it finished solidifying. Temari whipped out her fan, and Baki, her instructor in using the wind element, conjured up his strongest wind attack. Together they batted at the cloud of poison gas that Gaara had prevented from landing on the city. They attacked and sent as much wind as possible towards it, trying to move it away from the city and towards the open desert. Sasori chuckled and moved with inhuman speed, his tail lashing out impossibly fast. Gaara's concentration was completely on keeping the sand shield over the city up, but his natural defensive shield rose up, cocooning him inside its near-impregnable shell. Sasori scratched a deep gouge in the orb before recoiling, and releasing a cloud of gas that hung over and clung to it. It seeped into the sand where a weapon would not be able to penetrate. It took a few seconds for Gaara to detect the gas inside his bubble, but too late. As the orb dissolved to allow him to evade, his body locked up. Sasori's tail lunged forward once more, impaling the sand user through the shoulder. Gaara coughed in pain, a splatter of blood flying out. His eyes narrowed and his hand grasped the tail. Without conscious thought, his defensive layer of sand went on the offensive, tracking down the length of the metal tail towards the body of Sasori. Sand engulfed the invader, and Gaara made the crushing movement with his free hand, executing a picture-perfect sand coffin. Blood fell freely from Gaara's wound, but he paid it no attention. He glanced towards the cloud of poison gas heading towards the open desert thanks to the efforts of Temari and Baki. His city safe for the moment, he slumped down onto his knees. The combination of maintaining the huge sand wall above the city and the blood loss proving to be finally too much, he slipped into unconsciousness, held up only by the metal tail still sticking through his body. Sasori's tail whipped back suddenly, breaking free of Gaara's grasp, allowing the Kazekage to fall to the ground. With a loud explosion, he burst out of the top of the sand coffin, landing neatly beside the comatose Gaara. Sasori ripped the tattered robes off of his body, revealing an armored shell. Without so much as a word, he tightened a coil around the prone Kazekage, and leapt into the air, flying towards the exit of Sunagakure, disappearing in his speedy movements. His summoned puppets disappearing behind him. The sand shield over the city began to fall apart, raining down over the city, coating it once again in the desert. Temari and Baki controlled their fall and landed on a nearby rooftop. They surveyed the poison gas, mostly dissipated, but some still falling towards the southern part of the city. Baki called down to his men. "Evacuate the southern city now! Masks on for everyone!" In a flash of activity, men raced to meet the falling doom, and tried to save as many as they could. Mado Guy, Lee and Ten landed next to Baki and Temari. "I lost track of Gaara and Sasori," Guy exclaimed. "It seems as if the Kazekage fell in battle." Baki nodded. "We have to track him and find him. But half our men are needed here to stave off that poison cloud." Guy motioned to his team. "We will go." Baki cursed and pulled out a small round stone with markings on it. "I had no idea I'd be using this so soon. But if Gaara is in the hands of Akatsuki, we may need the help of another Jinchuriku." He pressed the seals on the stone and spoke into it. "Gaara kidnapped by Sasori of Akatsuki. In pursuit heading north." The stone flashed bright white, then stopped glowing. After a few seconds a voice came through the stone. "Shit, it works. I'll be foo. Wait, what? Gaara? We're on our way." "Was that Jiraiya?" Guy exclaimed, marveling at the stone. It made no other noises though. Baki shrugged. "We cannot afford to wait on them. We will leave now." "Hold on, young one." The old man Ebizo walked over, along with his even older sister Chiyo. "The Kazekage saved every life in this city today, proving himself a greater man than his father ever was. I was going to decline teaching him in the true way of sand, but I've changed my mind. We will pursue them together." Chiyo grimaced at them all. "Besides, Sasori and I have some unfinished business." Baki grunted. "I'm sorry, elders, but we must move fast. The Kazekage's life depends on it. We are not as frail as you think. You are a baby to us, and forever shall we be above you." Ebizo shot him a steely look. He closed his eyes and faced the sky. Everyone watched in stunned silence as he reached out, pointing. "They are heading towards the mountains of Siddhartha. For now." He opened his eyes. "The grandfather of the desert knows where they are." "Then lead on, grandfather!" Guy shouted in glee. "Show us your fires of youth." Chiya cackled wildly and leapt off the building, followed by her grinning brother. "Tengoku, Tsunade!" Jiraiya burst into the hall of the White Tower. Most of the people he wanted to see were there discussing the building of the pilot village for trading. Kakashi, Old Man Tora, Tenchi, Tsunade, Guerrero, Mabry, and even the head of the wolf thieves Ali. There's been an attack on Sunagakure. Gaara was captured by Sasori. Akatsuki? Tsunade swore up and down. The village council, such as it was, had opted to share responsibilities while Naruto was away. This time around she was in charge, and she wished she wasn't. Both of our teams have gone off to Blood Country. That means some of us need to go help. She looked inquiringly at the group. They all nodded, and she shook her head. Okay, no, we all can't go. I'll go, and take Kakashi and Jiraiya. Whose turn was it next to lead the village? Ali grunted. Mine. But my clan wishes to be involved in the next mission. We have not made any contributions to this haven and wish to do so at the earliest possibility. Tsunade shrugged. Noted. You're in the next mission. Wait. Old Tora chimed in. I'm coming. I have a history with that Sasori. Fine. Let's go. Time is of the essence. Gear up, don't forget the home summons armbands so we can get back home when all is done. The wind stream takes an hour to get to Suna. We leave in 5 minutes. Wind country, east of Sunagakure. The trail is running cold. Baki cursed. He could no longer see any tracks in the quickly shifting sand. We do not need a trail, young one. We head towards the mountain. It is a straight line. Ebizo said. They were racing at a very fast speed through the sands of the desert. Baki glanced towards the respected village elder. All his knowledge of the man was through stories. He used to be one of the most feared sand users in all of Suna. The history books had stories of him and his family dating back hundreds of years. As long as there had been a Sunagakure, there was an Ibiza, the name passed down from father to son. Every new generation spending the first few decades of their life living out in the desert, to return to the village and help lead it. It was said that even now there was another, younger Ibiza out there somewhere in the desert, honing his skills. The other revered sibling Chio seemed to be enjoying the run. He had to hand it to them, they were not only keeping up, but seemed to almost be holding back to allow the rest of them to set the pace. It was remarkable for their age. He turned his head and watched the team from Konoha. He struggled with his perception of all Konoha Nin and the truth of these people. They were clearly on the side of his village, yet years of a cold war between the two villages had left no room in him for anything but mistrust. He could put that aside for now, though, if it meant getting Gaara back. They raced towards the speck of a mountain in the distance. Sasori entered the cave, having already laid out the traps that he'd planned from before. It would buy him enough time to complete this ritual. Laying out Gaara's body, he sat and summoned the chi and concentrated on the seals necessary to communicate with the others. After a minute, shadowy forms began to appear around him. Deidara is dead. I have the boy. Sasori rasped. Then it was a fair trade, the leader said. I am being pursued. I cannot say by how many. He held aloft a finger with an ornate ring, matching the one he himself wore. I was able to retrieve Deidara's ring, and most of the pieces of his body. Good. It will have to do. Use the rods I gave you and impale his main chakra points. I will take it from there. Itachi and Kisame will delay your pursuers long enough for us to finish the ceremony. Sarori didn't bother replying, nodding to two of his followers to leave the cave, and close it behind them. He quickly gathered the parts of Deidara's body he had been able to retrieve, head, half a torso, left arm, right thigh, and put it together. He used chakra strings to tie it all together as best he could. Swiftly he impaled the neck, arm, and torso with short black rods. Stepping back to check on his work, he nodded, then went about arranging Gaara's body for the ritual. The wind stream buffeted them from all sides, like a hot breath beating at their clothes, seeping into their pores. Tsunade, Jiraiya, Kakashi, and Old Man Tora flew through the air at impossible speed, clutching Yoshi's gliding contraption between them. The airstream that led to Sunagakure was a very fast one. Naruto had said as much, but it was a very different thing to experience it. Look! Jiraiya shouted to them, pointing downwards. A fast-moving small group were making their way through a sparse wooded area, towards a large mountain range. Despite what many thought, Suna was not all sand and dunes. Woodlands were also fairly common, its hardy trees having learned to survive with the barest minimum of water. The group was moving extremely quickly, and there was something familiar about two of the men in the group. Kakashi grimaced. I'd know that bowl cut anywhere. We must leave the wind stream. Tsunade didn't hesitate, clapping her hands together in a burst of chakra, the impact disrupting the stream enough for them to fall out of it. They unfurled the wings on Yoshi's machine and held on tight as it lurched upwards and forward. Jiraiya sweated profusely, his fear of heights kicking in full gear as they sped towards the ground, albeit at an angled controlled descent. His fears proved unfounded though. Yoshi had had more than enough time to work out the kinks in his invention. The Daedalus guided them safely to a stretch of flat land ahead of the party they were tracking. They folded it back up and Tsunade sealed it away in a scroll. It was at this moment that the contingent from Sunagakure burst into the clearing, startled at seeing a giant bird descend from the sky. Baki stared in disbelief at the ex-Konoha Nin, now Tangoku Nin standing before him. He'd sent the message for help a little over an hour ago. This response time was unreal. He filed that information away for future use. Baki recognized the members of the Tangoku team except the old man. He saw a look of recognition cross Abiza's face briefly, but asked no questions. He pointed towards the mountains, and without a word they all raced towards the captured Kazekage. Kisame grumbled as he sat next to Itachi. He considered the other Nin a friend as much as he had ever had one. But that didn't prevent him from cursing loudly about his choice of terrain for this ceremony. Itachi didn't even blink though, just beginning the transfer of power to possess his choice of Sasori's two minions. Kisame likewise did the same, making sure to only commit a small percentage of his chakra, keeping the rest for the ceremony, as well for his own defense. Realistically, it was a drop in the bucket for him, but no one needed to know exactly how much he was capable of, not even Itachi. Night came swiftly in the desert, bringing with it biting cold winds. The contingent from Sunagakure and Tangoku stopped running when they reached the foothills of the mountain range where they were sure Sasori had brought Gaara. They did not leave the area, Ebizo said quietly. They are somewhere in the rocks, deep within one of these mountains. The rocks are confusing, I cannot track them. They looked grim-faced, staring at the line of mountains stretching off into the distance. Kakashi made a quick jutsu sign and summoned his pack of ninja dogs. Guys, he said to them, look around the area and see if you pick up any scents. We're looking for a Jinchuriku and an S-class missing Nin. The dogs leapt off in many directions, searching for scents. Tsunade sat down on a rock, rubbing her forearms nervously. The more time we waste here, the more time Akatsuki has with Gaara, she grumbled. Jiraiya nodded. My sources say it takes some time for them to extract the Tanuki. 3 days, Chiyo said quietly. I've seen 3 such extractions in my lifetime. If the host is strong, that is. He can hold out for that long. She looked at the faces around her. Normally the host dies at the end. They stood in silence for a few minutes before one of Kakashi's ninja dogs, a small pug, came bounding back. I have a scent, he barked out. Just then another dog came in from another direction. I have them. Kakashi swore violently. He must have met up with some others and split up. Baki stepped in. We split up too. Jiraiya, take your contingent that way, he said, pointing after the second dog that had arrived. We will go with this pup. Hey, I'm not a pup, the pug whispered in the background. Without another word, the teams split up and raced off in their separate directions. As the sun rose over the hills, Jiraiya and the team from Tangoku entered a clearing to find a long figure standing before them. Itachi! Kakashi exclaimed. The Akatsuki member stood just watching them, waiting. Kakashi stepped forward, tensing. Tsunade put out her arm, stopping him. She glared at Itachi. I think you're better move, boy. I'm not in the best of moods. Itachi looked over the team. 2 of the legendary Sannin, the White Wolf of Konoha, and an old man I do not recognize, but judging by your present company, you're no civilian. Old man Tora nodded at the shinobi, but said nothing. Jiraiya whispered to Tora, don't look directly at his eyes. He's a genjutsu master. Tsunade lowered her hand, and Kakashi disappeared in a blur. His speed unimaginable as he shot like lightning towards Itachi. His right hand began to crackle and the sounds of birds chirping filled the air. He thrust forward into the body of Itachi, penetrating clean through his chest. For a split second Tsunade thought he'd done it, but then suddenly Itachi burst into a flock of crows. Shit! She clasped her hands together quickly. We're caught in his genjutsu. She made a quick hand sign, as did Jiraiya. Dispel. They both dispelled the illusion. Itachi was several yards ahead still, but Kakashi was not moving, frozen in the position he'd ended up in having impaled Itachi. Tsunade raced forward to help Kakashi, while Jiraiya turned to look at Tora. The old man was frozen in place as well. Jiraiya touched him and surged a small burst of chakra into him, disrupting the genjutsu he was caught in. Tora awoke with a start and fell to his knees gasping. How many days? Jiraiya grimaced. It appears Itachi was using one of the most feared genjutsu of the Uchiha clan. The target could be trapped for seconds and it felt like days, years maybe. All while being tortured endlessly. It's just been a few seconds. The roar of Tsunade startled him before he could finish. She was airborne, launching herself at Itachi. Kakashi lay on the ground now, having also been dispelled of the illusion. Tsunade kept her eyes away from Itachi's eyes, trusting only her peripheral vision. His hand moved quickly, a fast movement, but nothing that could withstand her brute strength. With a loud crack, her fist passed right through where his body had been and cracked the ground beneath them, erupting a large fountain of sand and rock. Another genjutsu! Tsunade cursed, finding herself in a place with no one and nothing else. Except Itachi, who was coming at her with a sword. She was unable to move as he ran her through with the sword. Another Itachi appeared, also impaling her with his sword. And another, and another. Tsunade would have passed out from the pain, but she kept her head, focused on the pain and pumped chakra into her own body. Dispel! She slumped to the ground gasping. How is he putting us into genjutsu? She shouted back at Jiraiya. We're not making eye contact. Jiraiya leapt towards her. I don't know, but I've had enough of this. Stay down. His hands were a blur, and a series of saban needles with small inscriptions on them flew out of his hair in a full 360 degrees. Another hand movement, and the needles multiplied, and multiplied again, and again. 20 became, 100 became 500. The unavoidable barrage was almost impossible to dodge or see. A sudden explosion to the right of them, and they saw Itachi skid to the left, clutching his right arm. My blood bomb saban needles. They explode on contact with even a drop of blood. You were known as a genius in your clan, but illusions or not, your body has to be somewhere. And no one can dodge physical attacks forever. Itachi got up and used his hand to dust off his robes. Jiraiya stepped forward, into the same plane that Tsunade had found herself in. Shit! As the first swords penetrated him, he began to prepare his own dispel jutsu, when it all disappeared around him. He stumbled clutching at imaginary wounds, when he saw Itachi impaled on the tail of what looked like a living nightmare, a scorpion the size of a small house. Incredulously he watched as the scorpion's claws grabbed Itachi's body, slid it off the end of the sharp tail. Blood was pouring out his mouth, and he was about to say something when the claws ripped him in two and flung the parts in two different directions. The scorpion breathed heavily, then crumbled into rocks and sand. Jiraiya looked over and saw old man Tora stand up defiantly. Pay back, you little punk, he whispered under his breath. Tsunade and Kakashi got up slowly as well, walking over to the top half of Itachi's twitching body. Tora and Jiraiya joined them a few seconds later. Who is that? Tsunade asked quietly. The body in the ditch was wearing Itachi's clothes, but his face was no longer that of the ex-Konohanin. He was mouthing words, but only blood and bubbles were escaping. Jiraiya knelt down by the body, and pulled off a ring off the fingers of the body, letting the hand fall back. A soldier of Akatsuki. This was a delaying tactic. They must have used a jutsu to make him look like Itachi. He held up the ring. This might have been how we were being put under the illusion. I'll need to study it further. He glanced up at Tora. Remind me not to get on your bad side. Baki and Team Guy entered a ravine, scrambling under the evening mist. It had been almost a solid day of following this trail. They'd left Sunagakure at most an hour behind Sasori, yet because he knew where he was going, and had done several tradecraft tricks to hide his trail, they'd lost more than an entire day just trying to find him. They came upon a small stream beside the edge of a forest, and a lone figure standing before them. His smile ridged with sharp teeth arrayed in it, beckoning them forward. Later. Tired, the teams converged on the rock wall that the ninja dogs said the scent ended. Baki rested Guy against a tree, the Konoha nin exhausted after his fight with Kisame, only to learn that it was just a clone. He exchanged a look with Tsunade, who came over and began examining the quirky dresser of Konoha. Baki stepped forward and examined the rock wall. It's a door. There's a cave beyond it, he said quietly. Night had fallen again. By his count, they had another 12 hours to find Sasori and save Gaara. This close, Baki allowed himself some hope that they would make it in time. Wait. Jiraiya stepped forward. That seal. He pointed up on the rock face. There was a small tag stuck to the wall. He put one foot on the wall and walked straight up towards it. He stooped down and studied it for a second. It's a trap seal. There are likely 2 or 3 others nearby. All must be removed at the same time, otherwise this place explodes. It looks quite powerful. Lee raised his hand. We will find them and pull them. He nodded his head towards Niji, and Ten and Jiraiya watched them disappear into the surrounding woods, searching for the trap seals. Jiraiya sat down hard. Nato Gai collapsed to the ground as well, the wounds sustained from his battle with Kisame wearing him down. Tsunade knelt beside him and took the opportunity to tend to his wounds. The Kazekage better hold on, we're close. They're close. Itachi's shadow spoke quietly in the cave. Very. Kisame's shadow replied. It doesn't matter. The leader claimed. It is almost done. Gaara's body had risen into the air. The streams of chakra were flowing faster now, out of his mouth into the mouth of the giant statue that stood in the dark. The shadows in the room kept up their chanting. They will not make it in time. Found it. Lee spoke into his headset. So have I, Niji confirmed. Hold on. I think yes? I've found mine too. Ten chimed in. Pull it. Now. Kakashi pulled the tag off the rock wall in unison with Lee, Ten and Niji. Well, this is interesting, Kakashi uttered, staring at the clone of himself. The rock wall had crumbled easily, but this automatic defensive jutsu had activated, creating a perfect copy of Kakashi. Baki grunted. We don't have time for this. Kakashi, you'll have to handle this on your own, we're going in. He, Tsunade, Jiraiya, Old Man Tora, Ebizo and Chio leapt past the fake Kakashi into the darkness of the cave. Kakashi sighed and took up an offensive taijutsu position, watching as his mirror image duplicated his move. What do we have here? The voice floated in the gloom of the dark cave, echoing off of the mossy walls, dripping with malevolence. The giant cavern was poorly lit, but by what light there was, the teams from Tangoku and Sunagakure were able to see a long figure standing over the prostrate body of the Kazekage. Another body lay not far away, but this one was in several pieces. Large holes showing in his skin where something had been jammed in post-mortem. Clearly whatever purpose Daidara had served had now been fulfilled. Not 1, but 2 of the Sannin? Sasori chuckled. I should feel flattered. His masked face snapped to the other people in the room. So, you're still alive, old woman? Chio did not laugh for once. She nodded, her eyes a mix of emotions. Her brother Ebizo touched her shoulder. He did not spare a glance towards the puppeteer. Old Man Tora stepped forward. Sasori of the Red Sands. Do you remember me? Sasori tilted his head slightly. No. Tora grinned. Maybe this will help. He made a quick hand sign, then slammed his palms into the ground. In a flash, large rocks in the ground became even larger snakes, striking out at Sasori. The puppeteer leapt backwards, avoiding the onslaught. 10, 20, 40, the number of rock snakes that Tora produced and directed to attack kept multiplying. Not being real creatures, their speed was phenomenal. Baki used the opportunity as Sasori was forced away to race to Gaara's form. He felt that his neck, then looked up. He has a pulse, though it is very weak. Sasori laughed even while jumping and avoiding the snakes. Ah. Kazemo. Tora Kazemo. I remember you now. This is quite the reunion today, between grandmother and yourself. When was it? 20 years ago that I killed her? 20 years since you were unable to protect her? Tora Kazemo, the head of the Tora clan and the master of the clan's secret Dobutsu Suzu technique, gritted his teeth and bore down his chakra. A giant scorpion burst from the ground, sending dirt and stone flying everywhere. Sasori's smaller, quicker scorpion-shaped body tried to dodge, but the giant scorpion's tail was quicker, cracking open Sasori's shell. What the hell, that's not his body? Jiraiya asked. No. Tora spit out through gritted teeth. The real monster is inside. Sasori stepped out of the rubble. He was a boy of about 15 years, wearing pristine Akatsuki robes. His face was remarkably unlifelike, however, his eyes unblinking, staring maniacally at them. It's been a while since someone forced me to show my true self. He stepped forward lightly, his movements more fluid than they had a right to be. I'm glad we get to finish this fight. If I remember correctly, the last time I attacked your clan homestead, I impaled your wife, and almost decapitated you. What say we fix that almost? In a massive explosion of sound and smoke, 100 floating puppets appeared behind and beside Sasori. Meet my army. Jiraiya glared. He'd heard of the famed puppet army of Sasori of the Red Sands. It was a fearsome weapon. He'd also had no idea the level of history that existed between Sasori and Tora. Filing that information away for later, he spared but a glance to where Chiyo and Tsunade were examining Gaara. Ebizo seemed more content to watch the battle, however. That left himself, Baki and Tora to handle one of the most dangerous S-class ninjas in the bingo book. Tora's giant scorpion attacked again, but its rock body was destroyed easily by the scores of puppets Sasori was controlling. Baki unsheathed his sword and swung with a cutting wind attack, hoping to reduce the numbers. The air slash struck 2 puppets and sent pieces flying. But within seconds, Sasori twitched his fingers and the puppets were put back together. Ebizo spoke softly. All puppeteers use chakra strings to connect to and control their puppets. I've never seen someone control so many so effectively. Sasori really is a prodigy among puppet users. Thanks, but maybe we can admire his skill later. Jiraiya grunted, narrowly avoiding a diving puppet that looked like a clown. Tora grunted and dug deep, flowing as much chakra as he could manage into the ground itself. The cave began to rumble. A small army of monkeys burst from the ground, going after the army of puppets. The monkeys ran rampant, howling and shrieking and tearing at limbs and heads, smashing wooden parts. The entire scene was madness for many minutes. Tora collapsed in exhaustion, his eyes glazing over. Ebizo walked over to him and cradled him, carrying him closer to where Tsunade and Chiyo were treating Gaara. As the fight raged around them, he saw the look on Chiyo's face as she watched Gaara. He's dying. The monster I put inside him has been ripped out. A tear rolled down her face. Help me, brother. Ebizo nodded and looked back over to where the battle raged. Jiraiya had called out one of his Battletoads, and the odds were moving back in their favor. Sasori controlled 100 puppets, but puppets were no match for the numbers that Tora had created, nor the strength of Jiraiya, or the resilience and anger of Baki. Still, this fight had gone on long enough, and Ebizo was angry at the pending death of the Kazekage. Sasori. His words were little more than a whisper, but everyone in the cave stopped. His voice had seemed to come from within the very mountain itself. I won't ask you to surrender. It has gone too far. I see no benefit to capturing you alive. I'm giving you a chance, though. A chance to make peace with yourself. Sasori snorted. What are you talking about, old man? Your clan barely hangs on by a thread. What can an old advisor like you threaten me with? Ebizo shook his head. You're wrong. I have no clan. I have had no clan for over 1,000 years. He raised his arms to his sides, the ground seemed to move. Not shake, but almost rippled like liquid. Jiraiya leapt back and away, landing on a hard rock formation. Baki and Sasori did the same. It took a few seconds, but Jiraiya realized that the ground wasn't rippling, but rather the ground was alive with small creatures, thousands of them, millions maybe. They looked like silverfish, small and sleek, writhing just beneath the sand's surface. They were swirling in the ground, going around and around Ebizo. Slowly they broke the surface, and began to cover his skin. There was never more than one Ebizo. There has always only been me. Every 50 years I return to the desert. The desert that I am part of. The silverfish-like creatures writhed and squirmed, covering every inch of Ebizo including his face. The writhing slowed, then stopped, the creatures forming a leather skin casing. As Jiraiya and the others watched, Ebizo seemed almost to absorb the leather skin and all the creatures. In the space of a minute it was all gone, and Ebizo looked to be in his early 20s, standing like a statue, eyes staring at nothing in particular. Even Sasori seemed dumbstruck. His eyes opened, and bright gold eyes stared straight back at Sasori. I am Ebizo, rider of the true grandfather of the desert. He motioned his hand and the mountain truly rumbled this time. The ceiling threatened to cave in, stalagmite falling around them. Jiraiya rushed over to Gaara, and scooped him up, racing for the exit. He didn't spare a glance to know that Tsunade had picked up Chiyo and was right on his heels, Baki and Tora not far behind. Whatever was happening in this cave, none of them wanted to be part of it. Sasori watched in amazement as the hideout crumbled. Ebizo seemed unaffected by the damage being done, no rocks or dirt coming anywhere near him. With a curse, Sasori directed his force of puppets to kill the old man. Out the ground burst a giant cloud of dust, followed by a worm larger than even Orochimaru's snake summons. The worm swallowed and crunched the vast majority of the puppets. Sasori tried to direct his chakra strings to reconstitute the broken puppets, but the chakra cut off close to the worm. "What is this?" he bellowed over the din, his smooth face not giving any signs of his internal distress. Another sandworm burst upwards, narrowly missing him. The sandworm exploded out of the mountain, leaving a gaping hole exposing the noon sky. The rumbling worsened, the very cave collapsing. This is the end," Ebizo said matter-of-factly. "Meet the only clan I'll ever have." Sasori lashed out with the metal cable stinger he had coiled inside his hollow torso. It sped towards Ebizo's head, looking to spear it in an instant. He used his puppeteering skills to ensure it came in from an unexpected angle. A move that had never ever failed to kill its intended victim. Except this one time. Ebizo didn't move. He just seemed to be slightly to the right of where he was before. Sasori recognized it for what it was, near godlike speed. Ebizo grasped the spike at the end of the cable and tore it off, pulling at the cable itself to draw Sasori close. Sasori cursed and leapt backwards, disconnecting the cable from his body, the propellers on his back giving him a sudden burst of speed. His unblinking eyes didn't see when Ebizo disappeared, only to reappear behind him. So fast," he uttered just as his propellers were torn off like paper, Ebizo's fingers digging into them without any resistance. A hidden trap sprung in the back of his head and poison gas exploded outwards in what would be a fatal attack in any circumstance. The old man was no longer in the danger zone, however, having kicked Sasori away the instant he tore off the propellers. Sasori rolled and came up, his left hand unhinging and letting loose a stream of fire, trying to track the impossibly fast-moving elder. All the while more sandworms, larger and smaller, both kept breaking ground and destroying more of the mountain. "You'll bring the cave down on us both," Sasori shouted. Ebizo appeared at his left side and tore off Sasori's left arm. Sasori fell to his right, a blade coming out of his right hand and slashing wildly. The old Sunanin stood there, his calm demeanor not indicative of the peril they were in. "The mountain will be reshaped, but cannot be destroyed. That's one thing you young children never learned about the desert. The land is eternal. You must be part of it." All the worms suddenly burrowed back into the ground, disappearing in a cacophony of noise and dust. The ceiling to the cave was gone, most of this side of the mountain had collapsed. Sasori looked up at the night sky, a full moon shining down on their battle. He had ended up next to the pieces of Deidara's body. His old teammates' unseeing eyes looked directly at him. Part of his face had been burned off in the explosion that had claimed his life, the lips seared away to reveal a sneer that Sasori would swear was directed at him. With a curse he kicked the head away, and turned, looking for Ebizo. "What the hell is going on in there?" Baki asked when they were far enough outside and away from the destruction of the cave. Jiraiya gently put Gaara down, shaking his head, realizing that he was carrying dead weight, then turned to look back the way they came. I honestly have no idea." Tsunade put Chio down as well. The old lady walked over to Gaara's body, nodding as if making a decision. Oddly, she laughed. "My Ebizo. He will handle my grandson for me." Baki growled. "Who is Ebizo? I've never heard any indication that he was such a fearsome fighter. That he was revered, yes, but this..." Chio cackled. "You children. Always thinking you know everything. Ebizo predates all of us. From a time before this time. He's the desert itself, pure primal destruction as you've not seen. Who do you think first captured the One-Tail? I met him when I was but a young girl, and our friendship has endured. So close were we that we were known as brother and sister. There are so very few true immortals left in this world." She grew somber. "This, though. Gaara is my responsibility. My flesh and blood has done this to the leader of our village. A leader whom I myself had cursed with that beast." The noise died down in the mountain, an eerie calm taking over the landscape. Not a night cricket made a noise. No wind blew. Out of the dark strode the silhouette of a man. Ebizo walked forward calmly, his hands wrapped around a small cylinder. "It is done, sister." His eyes didn't look at anyone else, his hand outstretched with the cylinder. Chiya held onto it, looking at it sadly. "What is that?" Kakashi asked, walking over. His own battle had taken a lot out of him. "This is the only piece of my grandson that was still human. His core. He is still alive, so to speak, in this casing." She handed it back to Ebizo, looking into his eyes. "Please take care of him." From the brush, other Sunagakure appeared, trickling in. There had been many others from the village that pursued their missing Kazekage. The total destruction of an entire mountain brought them in like a beacon. They didn't crowd the elders or the team from Tangoku though, instead asking questions of Baki and looking towards Gaara's lifeless body. Ebizo looked at Gaara's lifeless body, then back to Chiyo, oblivious to the others around him. "It is forbidden for a reason, sister. We've had this discussion. The desert claims back what it should. Dust to dust. He is gone." Chiyo shook her head. "My wrongdoing. My blood did this to him. I put it in him, and my grandson tore it out. This is balance, brother." She touched her hand to his face. They stayed like that for a few more seconds, then she turned and knelt beside Gaara. Her hands began to glow blue. Tsunade's eyes grew large. "No!" She moved as if to stop the old woman. Ebizo gripped her wrist, firmly yet gently. Tsunade found herself unable to break free. She supposed she could have if she exerted her inhuman strength, but Ebizo was an ally. "Stop her! That technique, I've read about it. It is forbidden." Ebizo's voice was cold. "Watch it and learn, Tsunade. Or this technique dies with her, and I will not be sorry to see that happen." They all stood in silence as Chiyo executed a perfect self-sacrifice resurrection jutsu. Her face drained of color, as the chakra poured through her hands into Gaara's chest. Sweat beaded her forehead, the strain visible. With a curse, Ebizo knelt beside her and touched her shoulder, feeding chakra to her so she could complete her last wish. Gaara coughed. Chiyo looked over at the crowd gathered for Gaara, smiled, then collapsed sideways. Ebizo held her softly as the coughs racked Gaara's reanimated body. The Kazekage opened his eyes. "Blood country, we can pop out over there." Naruto pointed to a hill that the wind stream dipped close to. By close, of course, he meant it was several hundred feet at least above it. The girls held on to the smaller deadlifts that Yoshi had given them. The boys insisted they didn't need one, and Nuik looked with disdain at the contraption. Naruto disrupted the stream with a burst of chakra and they fell. Naruto decided he wouldn't destroy the landscape every time they traveled somewhere, so he pumped chakra into his legs, landing like an explosion in the ground. Nagi fell into his own shadow, disappearing then reappearing a second later. Senjia was a whirlwind with his swords, creating a small wind devil that buffeted his fall, allowing him to land semi-gracefully. The girls glided down on the Daedalus, touching down without incident. Nuik was just there. 1 minute he was in the air, the other he was standing calmly waiting on the ground. Naruto sheepishly climbed out of the hole he had created on impact. He dusted himself off, then looked around. "Okay, so where do we go from here?" Sakura brought out small compass and a map. "That way is the nearest major village and road. We can take this road all the way to the capital." She pointed north. "Then that's where we go," Naruto said, "but let's scout it a bit. This is sort of enemy territory." A lesson learnt long ago that Naruto didn't forget. He quickly formed the seals for his Kagebunshin. In seconds he had a team of 5 Narutos fanning out ahead, looking for any signs of an ambush or trap. They walked northwards, taking the opportunity to study the land. Much of what should have been green was blackened and soot-covered. The reason obvious. To the far north a mountain was spewing ash and black smoke. A volcano, Nuik happily explained to Naruto. No animals crossed their paths. No birds flew in the sky. "This land is dead," Senjai muttered. Naruto and Nagi nodded their heads in agreement. "It's not dead," Calamity spat. "It's dying. This could all spring back to life." She kicked over a pile of ash to expose a small green grass struggling to reach the sunlight. "Life always finds a way," she said quietly. Nuik looked at her, no one seeing the proud glint in his eye. An hour later, as they were nearing the village, one of Naruto's clones burst through the foliage into their midst. "Up ahead! Hurry!" They raced after the clone towards the village, hearing by this point the sound of shouts coming from somewhere ahead. It took just a few minutes for them to reach the village. The Banished led them through a narrow alleyway onto what was likely the main square of the town. Every citizen must have been gathered there. At least a few hundred people were present. All shouting and swearing, some brandishing torches, others carried weapons like pole axes and staffs. At the center of the square, Naruto saw what the commotion was about. A woman and her 2 children were alight, having been set on fire by the men around her in what had to be seconds before their arrival. Their screams reached to the sky to the seeming delight of the crowd gathered. Naruto stood in shock for a mere second, but Naruto acted faster. The Shinanju master was suddenly on the platform, knocking the men out of the way. The fire raged, however, and the children's screams went silent, leaving only the woman's voice raised above the crowd's roar of approval. Naruto was smothering the woman with his robe, killing the flames. Naruto and his friends leapt to the platform to help, but it was too late. Naruto moved his robe and revealed a charred face grimacing in painful death. The children still burned, so Naruto copied Naruto and took off his shirt, smothering them and trying to put out the fires, Sakura following suit. Senji growled at the men on the platform who were now getting to their feet. The men were ordinary farmers, no longer menacing. In fact, if Senji had to describe their expressions, it would be extreme disinterest. In fact, the entire crowd had gone eerily quiet. Naruto's anger would not be contained, though. Why? He bellowed at the men, his rage breaking the surface. His jacket, singed and blackened with soot, lay forgotten on the platform. No one answered. The wind howled through the village, only being disrupted by the shuffling of feet as the crowd quietly dispersed, heading their separate ways. The men on the platform turned to go as well. Sakura and the 2 girls were at the edge of the platform where the steps were. Her anger was also barely contained. As one of the men tried to walk past her, she grabbed him by the throat, lifted him and slammed him down onto the platform, splintering the wood and sending them crashing through into the dirt below. The other men looked at that but registered no expression. Naruto grabbed one by the shirt and lifted him. His eyes burned with an inner flame, the pupils turning to slits. Why? He questioned again. Why do such a thing? The man shrugged. Strangers wouldn't understand. Naruto punched him in the stomach. Hard. The man doubled over and coughed up blood. Naruto stood him back upright. Tell me. The man spit out a gob of blood and tissue. His face still registered nothing. Her husband died 3 days ago. She had no family to care for her or the children. The magistrate granted her petition to die. She begged for it. A quick death is better than what most of us will suffer. The team from Tangoku stood in shock. Nagi was the first to say anything. She asked to be set on fire? The man shrugged. The magistrate decides the method. She was not the first this week. Won't be the last to choose death. Food is scarce. Money to buy it non-existent. I myself have not eaten anything but dead rats in over a week. Her children had not eaten in days. There is nowhere to go but the nothingness after this life. Naruto held on to the man's shirt, his head hanging down. Tears fell from his face. Could no one care for them? The man shook his head. Those were the last children in this village. No one wanted to be burdened with those extra mouths to feed. He shoved the man hard, sending him off the platform. The image of the burning family seared forever into his brain. He looked at Nagi, who was ashen. The truth hitting them hard. Life in the Blood Country was a nightmare. Noik stood off to the side, taking in the interactions. He dusted off his coat and folded it over his arm. He studied his students' faces, noting the distress they displayed. He was glad they had enough humanity in them to be disturbed by this still. He fervently hoped that the years would never take that from them. He glanced down at the burnt corpse of the woman and her children. Previously he had felt slight anger at such cruelty. Now he felt intense disgust at the entire village for their cowardice. No matter the cruelty of his master, a man who would not choose to live was not a man. Not one worth living and breeding. He paid special attention to the reaction of his Tenshikage. Lord Naruto was very emotional. Noik had not decided whether that was a good thing or bad thing yet. Time would tell. For now he followed this lord, and neither he nor his students would disappoint. Let's get out of here, Nagi said quietly. This Lord Shusho has more to answer for than I thought. They all filed out of the village, heading for the road that would take them to the capital. They walked in mostly silence until nightfall, making camp in a clearing away from the road. It was a restless night for all. So they noticed when Noik disappeared from camp early in the evening, and when he reappeared at the crack of dawn the next day. Where did you go, sensei? Nagi asked, pulling on his boots. Noik shrugged. Back to that village. Their cowardice offended me. Naruto, Senji, Nagi, Sakura, Calamity and Haruka all froze. Naruto was the first to speak. The men on the platform? Noik stretched and poured some hot water into a small pouch that Calamity knew was tea. All of them. They wished for death instead of life. He began walking back to the road to continue their trek. I felt in a giving mood last night. Senji turned to Nagi. Does he mean what I think he does? Nagi and Calamity nodded. He wiped out that village. Calamity answered quietly. She picked up her small traveling bag and walked after her sensei. The rest of them followed.